Tonight, we tell the story of a legion that was murdered by its own father, not betrayed, not corrupted, not seduced by whispered promises of power or led astray by the slow, creeping influence of the ruinous powers. The World Eaters were murdered, methodically, deliberately, one brain at a time. Their father hammered iron nails into their skulls, rewired their nervous systems, burned away their capacity for thought and feeling and everything that made them human, and turned them into something that could only kill, could only rage, could only charge screaming into the teeth of the enemy and tear them apart with hands and teeth and the chain-edged weapons that became their legion's signature. And the worst part, the detail that makes the World Eater's story the most tragic in the entire Horus Heresy, is that the father who did this to them was himself a victim. Angron did not choose the butcher's nails. Angron did not want the butcher's nails. Angron was a slave, chained and beaten and operated on without his consent, and the nails were hammered into his skull by masters who wanted nothing from him except violence, who saw him not as a person but as a weapon, who treated his pain as a feature rather than a flaw. And when Angron found his legion, when the Emperor placed him at the head of 100,000 warriors who looked up at him with eyes full of hope and loyalty, and the desperate aching need of sons who had finally found their father, Angron looked back at them and saw not sons, but raw material, not warriors, but victims, not a legion but a reflection of himself, and the reflection was wrong, because the legion was whole and Angron was broken, and broken things cannot tolerate the sight of wholeness, so he broke them to match. This is the story of the World Eaters, the 12th Legion, the Warhounds, the Eaters of Cities, the sons of Angron, the Red Angel, the Lord of the Red Sands, the Primarch who was never loyal to the Emperor, who stole him from his dying brothers, who never loved the Imperium that treated him as a weapon, who never believed in the Great Crusade that demanded his obedience while denying him the one thing he had ever wanted, which was simply to stand beside the people who mattered to him and fight until the fighting was done, who never had the chance to be anything other than what Nuceria's masters made him. There is a question at the heart of the World Eater's story, and it is not the question you might expect. The question is not, why did they fall to chaos? Every traitor legion has an answer to that question, and the answers are various and complex and interconnected in ways that scholars of the heresy have spent 10,000 years analyzing. The World Eaters fell because their Primarch was broken, and because the nails made them susceptible to the blood god's influence. That answer is simple. The question is, what were they before? What were the Warhounds? What kind of legion might the 12th have become if Angron had landed on a world that nurtured him rather than one that enslaved him? If the nails had never been implanted, if the young Primarch's empathic gift had been allowed to develop, to mature, to shape the legion in the image of a leader who could feel the pain of others, and who chose to fight not for the pleasure of killing, but for the abolition of suffering. The lore offers glimpses, fragments, hints of what might have been, buried in the accounts of the Warhound's early history, in the descriptions of the legion before Angron's arrival, a legion that was aggressive but disciplined, fierce but loyal, brutal in combat but capable of mercy. A legion that fought hard and cared deeply and understood, in a way that the nails would later make impossible, that violence was a tool and not a purpose. What would the 12th have been with an Angron who was whole, with a Primarch who could feel his son's emotions, who could share their burdens, who could lead them not through fear and pain, but through the empathic connection that the High Riders of Nuceria destroyed? The answer is, we will never know. The nails ensured that. Nuceria ensured that. The Emperor, in his choice to save the Primarch and abandon the gladiators, ensured that. The question is unanswerable, and the unanswerable nature of the question is itself the tragedy, because the World Eaters were denied not just their future but their past. Not just what they might have become, but any possibility of knowing what they might have become. Close your eyes if you like. This one hurts. Let us begin before the breaking. Let us begin with the legion that Angron destroyed. The Warhounds. The 12th Legion was created on Terra during the Unification Wars, drawn from the genetic template of the Primarch who would later be called Angron, though the Legion did not know his name or his nature during those early years. They were one of the 20 original Space Marine Legions, created by the Emperor to conquer the galaxy and bring humanity under a single banner, and from the very beginning the 12th had a reputation. They were aggressive, direct, brutal, by the standards of the other legions, which is saying something, because the other legions were not gentle organizations. The Warhounds favored close assault, charging the enemy at speed and overwhelming them in hand-to-hand combat. And they did it well. Their assault doctrine was effective, efficient, and devastatingly lethal. They were the Imperium's shock troops, the first wave, the breach force, the legion that the Emperor deployed when a position needed to be taken quickly and the cost of taking it was secondary to the speed. But the Warhounds were not mindless. This is the detail that the later history of the 12th Legion tends to obscure, and it is the detail that makes their transformation so painful to examine. Before Angron, the Warhounds were disciplined. They were professional. They fought with controlled aggression, channeling their ferocity into calculated assaults that achieved objectives with a precision that other legions respected even as they found the Warhounds' directness uncomfortable. They had traditions. They had honor codes. They had a system of dueling pits where warriors resolved disputes through ritual combat, and the duels were governed by rules that ensured the combatant's survival, because the purpose of the duel was not to kill, but to test, to prove, to establish hierarchy through merit rather than through murder. The Warhounds valued courage, strength, and the willingness to lead from the front, and they valued these qualities within a structure that kept the violence purposeful rather than indiscriminate. They had librarians, psychers, warriors whose minds reached into the warp and drew on its power to enhance their combat effectiveness, to shield their brothers, to read the flow of battle and adjust their tactics in real time. The Warhound's librarian was not large, not by the standards of the Thousand Sons or the Blood Angels, but it was functional, respected, and integral to the Legion's operations. They had a culture, not the refined philosophical culture of the Ultramarines or the mystical, shamanistic culture of the Space Wolves. A rougher culture, built around the shared experience of violence and the bonds that form between warriors who charge into hell together and somehow come out the other side. The Warhounds were brothers. They fought for each other. They bled for each other. They died for each other. There were moments, in the Warhound's history that shine through the darkness of what came later like lights through a closing door. Moments of kindness, of compassion, of the complex emotional engagement that the nails would later destroy. The Warhounds maintained a tradition of commemoration for their fallen. After each battle, the surviving warriors would gather and speak the names of the dead, recounting their deeds, their achievements, the moments that defined their service to the Legion. These ceremonies were rough, simple, unpolished by the standards of other Legion's funerary traditions. But they were genuine. The Warhounds mourned their dead. They honored the fallen. They carried the memory of the lost with them into the next fight, fighting not just for the living, but for those who had gone before. The nails consumed this tradition along with everything else. The World Eaters do not mourn. They cannot mourn. The neural pathways that process grief, that create the emotional response of loss, that allow a warrior to feel the absence of a fallen brother, have been burned away by the implants. A World Eater who watches a comrade fall in battle feels nothing except the nail's relentless demand for the next kill. The dead are irrelevant. The living are targets. The distinction between the two is temporary and, from the nail's perspective, unimportant. This loss of mourning is in many ways the most profound damage that the nails inflict. Killing can be justified, violence can be directed, rage can be channeled, but the inability to mourn, the inability to feel the weight of loss, the inability to honor the dead and carry their memory forward, cuts the World Eaters off from the most fundamental human experience. The knowledge that the people we lose matter, that their absence diminishes us, that the pain of their loss is the price we pay for having loved them. The World Eaters pay no price. They feel no loss. They carry no memories of the fallen, because the nails have consumed the capacity for memory that makes such carrying possible. They are, in this regard, the poorest beings in the galaxy. Warriors who have lost everything and cannot even feel the poverty of their condition. And they did it with a fierce, uncomplicated loyalty that was, in its way, one of the purest expressions of the brotherhood that the Emperor had intended the legions to embody. The Warhounds took pride in their aggression, but they took equal pride in their control. A Warhound who lost control during a battle, who allowed his aggression to override his tactical judgment, who killed beyond what the mission required, was not celebrated. He was counseled. He was retrained. He was, if the behavior persisted, subjected to the discipline of the dueling pits, where his brothers would remind him, through the language of controlled violence, that the 12th Legion's strength lay not in uncontrolled fury, but in fury that had been honed, directed and deliberately unleashed at the right moment against the right target. This distinction between controlled and uncontrolled aggression was the Warhound's defining characteristic, the quality that separated them from mere berserkers. They were not bulls that charged at the sight of red. They were hounds that waited for the master's signal and then struck with a precision that made their aggression twice as effective as raw, undirected violence could ever be. The nails eliminated this distinction entirely. After the implantation, there was no controlled aggression. There was only aggression. This was the 12th Legion before Angron. Brutal, yes. Aggressive, certainly. But functional. Disciplined, human, in the way that genetically enhanced killing machines can be human. Capable of thought, of feeling, of the complex emotional responses that distinguish a warrior from a weapon. The Warhounds had commanders of their own before Angron, warriors who led the Legion with the combination of aggression and discipline that defined its character. Lork was among the most notable, a warrior of such distinction that he became one of the Legion's first dreadnoughts, his broken body interred in an armored sarcophagus that allowed him to continue fighting long after his flesh had failed. Lork had served as a warhound in the decades before Angron's arrival, and he would live, entombed in his walking coffin, long enough to watch the Legion he loved transformed into something he could barely recognize. Lork was spared the butcher's nails. His dreadnought status made the implantation impossible, and this accident of circumstance turned him into something rare and terrible, a witness. Lork watched, from inside his armored shell, as the Warhounds adopted the nails one by one, as the discipline faded and the rage took its place, as the brothers he had fought beside for decades became strangers, then berserkers, then something that was not quite human anymore. He watched and he remembered, and the memory was a torture that the nails could not have surpassed. Because Lork remembered what the Legion had been, and what he saw around him was the ashes of everything he had valued. What horrified Lork most was not the transformation of the Legion's combat doctrine, though that was terrible enough. It was the slaughter of the Loyalists on Istvan III. Watching his brothers kill each other, watching the fratricidal horror of Legion against Legion, was the moment when Lork understood that the Warhounds were not merely changed, but dead. The Legion he had served no longer existed. What remained was something wearing its armor and carrying its name, but the soul, the identity, the culture that had made the Warhounds what they were, had been consumed by the nails as thoroughly as the nails consumed neural tissue. Lork remained loyal to his Primarch, even as his Primarch destroyed everything he loved. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of the old Dreadnaught's story. His loyalty outlasted his hope. He served Angron not because he believed in what Angron was doing, but because he was a warhound. And warhounds did not abandon their brothers, no matter how far their brothers had fallen. During the Shadow Crusade, as Angron was being transformed into a Daemon Prince by Lorgar's sorcery, Lork finally broke. The old dreadnought, who had watched the destruction of everything he valued with a stoic endurance that had lasted decades, could not watch this. He attacked the word-bearers, charging Lorgar himself in a final suicidal act of defiance that was less a military action and more a statement. This far and no further. This is where I draw the line. This is where the Warhounds die, not in glory but in protest. Because the alternative is to stand by and watch the last fragment of what we were consumed by what we have become. Lork died. Of course he died. A single dreadnought against a Primarch is not a contest. But the manner of his death, the choice that drove it, the refusal to accept the final degradation of his Legion's identity, was the last genuinely noble act that any member of the 12th Legion would perform. The Warhounds died with Lork. Everything that followed was the World Eaters. Angron destroyed all of it. But to understand why, you need to understand what Nuceria did to him first. The Primarchs were scattered from Terra during their infancy, each one cast across the galaxy by forces that have never been fully explained, landing on different worlds that shaped them in different ways. Some landed on civilized worlds that nurtured them. Some landed on harsh worlds that hardened them. Angron landed on Nuceria, and Nuceria did something worse than either nurturing or hardening. Nuceria broke him. Nuceria was a civilized world, inasmuch as it had cities and technology and a ruling class that maintained order. It was also a world built on slavery, on the institutionalized brutality of a ruling aristocracy called the High Riders, who maintained their power through a combination of wealth, political manipulation, and the public entertainment provided by their gladiatorial games. The games were the centerpiece of Nucerian culture, massive spectacles of organized violence in which slave warriors, captured or bred for the purpose, fought and died for the amusement of the crowd. The infant Primarch was found in the mountains of Nuceria, surrounded by the evidence of violence that even then marked his presence. The slavers who found him recognized his value immediately. He was larger than any human child should be, stronger, more durable. He healed from wounds that should have killed him. He was, in the language of the slave market, premium stock, a gladiatorial prospect of extraordinary potential. They sold him to the fighting pits. The gladiatorial pits of Nuceria were not the arena of ancient Rome, though the comparison is often drawn. They were industrial operations, facilities that processed slave warriors like raw materials, training them, enhancing them, and deploying them in matches that were designed not for athletic competition, but for spectacle. The audiences wanted blood. The High Riders delivered blood, and the fighters who delivered the most blood in the most entertaining fashion were rewarded with better food, better quarters, and the grudging respect of their captors. The young Primarch learned fast. He had to. The pits did not tolerate slow learners, and the fights were often to the death, decided not by points or by judges, but by the simple metric of who was still standing when the sand stopped moving. The Primarch's supernatural durability made him difficult to kill, but it did not make the fights easy. He was matched against multiple opponents, against armed opponents while he was unarmed, against beasts that the High Riders imported from off-world for the novelty value. Each fight was harder than the last, because the audiences demanded escalation, and the High Riders, who understood their market, delivered, but the young Primarch did something that the High Riders did not expect. He made friends. In the barracks between fights, in the training halls, in the brief, stolen moments of rest that the gladiatorial schedule allowed, the Primarch connected with his fellow fighters. His empathic gift, the ability to feel the emotions of others and to absorb their pain, made him a natural center of gravity for the other slaves. They gravitated toward him. They trusted him. They confided in him. And he, in turn, gave them something that no slave master could provide: the sense that their suffering was shared, that they were not alone, that someone understood their pain because they were literally, physically, psychically feeling it. The bonds that formed in the gladiatorial barracks were the closest thing to family that any of the slaves had ever known. The Primarch, who had been denied a family by the scattering that cast him across the galaxy, found his family among the slaves of Nuceria. They were his brothers and sisters. They were his people. They were the ones he would fight for, die for, and ultimately lose, and the loss would define everything that followed. What happened next is the foundational tragedy of the World Eaters, the wound that never healed, the original sin that poisoned everything that followed. The young Primarch, not yet called Angron, was put through the gladiatorial training program. He fought. He killed. He survived encounters that should have been fatal, because the Primarch physiology that the Emperor had designed into him made him virtually unkillable, and the slavers who owned him recognized this and exploited it, matching him against opponents that would have overwhelmed any ordinary gladiator. Because the spectacle of a seemingly invincible fighter was worth more in ticket sales than the fighter's safety was worth in replacement costs. But the young Primarch was not merely a fighter. He was, if the fragmentary accounts from this period can be believed, something more. Something that Nuceria's masters found both fascinating and deeply threatening. He was an empath. Before the nails, before the surgery, before the crude archaeotech was hammered into his skull, the Primarch who would become Angron possessed a psychic gift that was unique among the Primarchs. He could feel the emotions of others, not in the vague, intuitive way that some humans can read the mood of a room. Angron's empathy was a psychic gift, a genuine warp-derived ability that allowed him to sense the emotional states of the beings around him with a clarity that bordered on telepathy. He could feel their pain, their fear, their joy, their grief. And the feeling was not merely intellectual, it was physical. He absorbed the emotions of others into his own body, carrying their burdens in his flesh, sharing their suffering as though it were his own. Imagine what this meant for a gladiatorial slave. Imagine standing in the arena surrounded by other slaves who were about to fight and die, and feeling every one of their fears, every one of their sorrows, every one of their desperate hopes for survival flooding through your nervous system as though the emotions were your own. Imagine killing an opponent and feeling their death, not just seeing it but experiencing it, the terror, the pain, the final flickering awareness of a consciousness being extinguished. Now imagine what the 12th Legion might have become under a Primarch with that gift. A Primarch who could feel the emotions of his warriors, who could sense their morale, their fatigue, their readiness for combat, who could lead not through orders but through a shared emotional connection that made every warrior feel understood, valued, known. The 12th would have been the most cohesive legion in the Imperium, a force bound together not by discipline or doctrine, but by the deep psychic empathy of a father who literally felt his son's pain, and who fought to spare them from it. The nails consumed this potential along with the gift itself. The empathy died on the operating table in Nuceria, killed by the crude archaeotech that was hammered into a child's skull by masters who valued violence over compassion. And the legion that the empathy might have built, the brotherhood that the gift might have sustained, the 12th that might have been, died with it. This is the World Eater's deepest wound, not the nails, not the rage, not the 10 millennia of bloodshed. The deepest wound is the knowledge, available only to those who study the lore carefully enough to see it, that the 12th Legion could have been the best of them all, the most loyal, the most compassionate, the most deeply connected to each other and to the humanity they were created to protect. Instead, they are the worst, the most brutal, the most degraded, the most completely consumed by the violence that was supposed to be their tool and that became, through the nails' intervention, their entire existence. The gap between what they could have been and what they are is the measure of the tragedy. And the gap is infinite. He could feel the emotions of others. He could absorb their pain. He could take the suffering of those around him into himself, carrying it so that they did not have to. And this gift, this extraordinary capacity for compassion and connection, was the thing about him that the High Riders feared most. Because a slave who can take away the pain of other slaves is a slave who can unite them. A slave who feels what others feel is a slave who cannot be isolated, cannot be broken through the usual methods of psychological manipulation that slave societies depend on. A slave with empathy is a leader, and a leader among slaves is a rebellion waiting to happen. The High Riders decided to solve this problem. They implanted the Butcher's Nails. The Butcher's Nails were archaeotech, relic devices from the dark age of technology that had been preserved on Nuceria and adapted for use by the gladiatorial industry. The nails were cybernetic cortical implants, crude devices that were hammered directly into the brain, into the pain and pleasure centers of the cerebral cortex, and wired into the nervous system through a network of fiber-optic neural connectors implanted in the spine. The nails rewired the brain. They suppressed the centers responsible for empathy, compassion, and complex emotional processing. They stimulated the centers responsible for aggression, rage, and the fight-or-flight response. And they did something else, something that made them not merely a weapon but a cage. They hurt. The nails produced constant, unrelenting pain. Not the acute, sharp pain of an injury which the brain can process and adapt to. A dull, grinding, bone-deep agony that permeated every waking moment, that filled the consciousness with a low, constant scream of neural static that drowned out thought, drowned out memory, drowned out everything except the rage and the overwhelming, desperate need to make the pain stop. The only thing that made the pain stop was violence. When the nails bearer fought, when they killed, when they plunged into the red haze of combat and gave themselves over to the aggression that the implants stimulated, the pain receded. Not disappeared, receded, pulled back to a tolerable level, replaced by a brief, intoxicating rush of neurochemical relief that was as close to pleasure as the nails would ever allow. The relief lasted as long as the fighting lasted. When the fighting stopped, the pain returned, worse than before. Hungrier, more insistent. The nails were a cage. A neurological cage that imprisoned the bearer in a cycle of pain and violence, forcing them to fight not because they chose to, but because fighting was the only escape from the agony that the implants produced. The nails did not make their bearers aggressive. They made them desperate. The violence was not a desire. It was a need as fundamental and as uncontrollable as the need for air. The young Primarch received the nails as punishment. Some accounts suggest he was punished for refusing to kill a fellow gladiator in the arena, for showing the mercy that his empathic nature demanded. Others suggest the nails were implanted preemptively, as a means of controlling a slave who was becoming too charismatic, too popular, too dangerous. The details vary. The result does not. The empathy died. The capacity for compassion, for connection, for the complex emotional responses that the Primarch's gift had provided was burned away by the nail's neurological rewiring. What remained was rage. Pure, unfiltered, all-consuming rage and the constant, grinding pain that could only be briefly relieved by the exercise of that rage on the bodies of whoever was put in front of him. The High Riders got what they wanted. The Primarch became their greatest gladiatorial attraction, a fighter of unmatched ferocity whose battles drew crowds from across the planet, and whose violence was so extreme, so spectacular, so completely unleashed, that the audiences could not look away. But the High Riders also got something they did not want. because the nails, for all their effectiveness at suppressing empathy and stimulating aggression, could not suppress the Primarch's will. And the Primarch's will was the will of a being engineered by the Emperor of mankind to conquer worlds. And a will of that magnitude does not submit to chains, no matter how deeply those chains are embedded in the bearer's skull. The Primarch escaped, not alone. He rallied his fellow gladiators, the slave warriors who had fought beside him in the pits, who had seen his strength, who had been inspired by his defiance. He broke his chains. He broke their chains. And together they fled into the mountains of Nuceria, a ragged army of escaped slaves armed with gladiatorial weapons, and the desperate fury of people who would rather die free than live in chains. The High Riders pursued them. 5 entire armies were raised to hunt the gladiators down, and the hunting was merciless. The hunt lasted months. The gladiators fought running battles through the mountains, their numbers dwindling with each engagement, their supplies running out, their bodies breaking under the accumulated damage of a campaign that they could not win. In the end, there were about 1,000 of them left. 1,000 gladiators cornered at a mountain pass, surrounded by 5 armies, with no possibility of escape and no hope of reinforcement. They dug their graves. They scraped holes in the rocky ground with their hands and their weapons, shallow graves that were a message to the enemy: we will not surrender. We will not be taken alive. We will fight, and we will die, and we will be buried here, in the ground we stood on when we made our last stand. It was the defining moment of Angron's life. Not the fighting, the choice, the decision to die alongside his brothers and sisters rather than to submit, rather than to return to the chains, rather than to accept the existence that Nuceria's masters had assigned to him. It was, in its savage, bloody way, the most noble act that any Primarch ever attempted. The most human. The most purely, desperately, magnificently defiant. A being who had been created to conquer the galaxy, who had been designed by the Emperor of mankind himself to be a weapon of cosmic power, chose instead to die in a ditch with the people he loved. Not for glory, not for the Emperor, not for the Great Crusade or the Imperium or the future of the human species. For his brothers and sisters, the gladiators who had fought beside him and bled beside him, and who had earned, through their shared suffering, the only loyalty that Angron would ever give. Every other Primarch, when they were found by the Emperor, came willingly, some eagerly, some reluctantly, but they all came. They all accepted the mantle of command that the Emperor offered, the legion that bore their gene seed, the role in the Great Crusade that their father had designed for them. Angron was the only one who said no, the only one who chose his adopted family over his biological one, the only one who would rather have died free than lived as a general. This is the tragedy. Not the nails, not the rage, not the 10,000 years of bloodshed that followed. The tragedy is that Angron's most human moment, his most noble choice, was the choice that the Emperor refused to honor. The Emperor took Angron's choice away from him, and in doing so he took away the only thing that might have saved the Primarch from the monster that the nails were making him. Angron had chosen to die for love. The Emperor chose to make him live for war. And the difference between those two choices is the difference between the gladiator who dug his own grave and the daemon who burns worlds, and the Emperor ruined it. The Emperor arrived at Nuceria in his flagship, observed the situation from orbit, and made a decision that would shape the fate of the 12th Legion and ultimately contribute to the fall of the Imperium itself. He did not save the gladiators. He could have. He had the firepower. He had the troops. He had the technology to turn 5 Nucerian armies into smoking craters in the time it took Angron to draw breath. He could have saved them all, Angron and his brothers and sisters, and he could have destroyed the High Riders and freed every slave on the planet and given Angron the victory that would have earned his loyalty and his love. He did not. He teleported Angron to his ship. Just Angron, alone ripped from the battlefield by the Emperor's technology, materialized on the deck of a vessel he had never seen, surrounded by strangers in golden armor who told him that his destiny lay among the stars. Behind him, on the surface of Nuceria, his gladiators fought their last battle. Without him, without their leader, they were overwhelmed. The High Riders' armies closed in and destroyed them. Every last one. Angron was told about this later. He learned that the people for whom he would have died, the people he had chosen over the Emperor's offer, were dead. Destroyed because the Emperor had decided that one Primarch was more valuable than 1,000 freed slaves. Angron never forgave this. He never forgave the Emperor. He never forgave the Imperium. He never forgave the universe for allowing it to happen. And the nails made sure he could not forget. The Emperor tried to remove the nails. He examined the implants with the full resources of the Imperium's most advanced technology and the full attention of his own superhuman intellect. He concluded that the nails could not be safely removed. The implants had grown into the brain. Their neural tendrils burrowed deep into the cerebral cortex, integrating with the organic tissue at a level that made extraction impossible without killing the Primarch. The nails were part of Angron now, and Angron, with the nails eating away at his brain, with the pain driving him toward violence in every waking moment, with the memory of Nuceria burning in what remained of his capacity for emotion, was given command of the 12th Legion. The Warhounds had found their father. Their father was about to destroy them. The reunion between Angron and the 12th Legion was not the joyous homecoming that the other Primarchs experienced. There was no moment of recognition, no embrace, no tears of relief from sons who had finally found their father. Angron arrived on the deck of the Warhound's flagship in a state of incandescent fury, and his first act as the commander of the 12th Legion was to kill several of his own warriors. He attacked them, without provocation, without warning, without any of the ritual or ceremony that the other Primarchs had used to introduce themselves to their legions. Angron simply erupted into violence, the nails screaming in his skull, the rage boiling over, and the Warhounds who were closest to him, the honor guard who had been selected to greet their Gene father, were torn apart before anyone could react. It took the Legion's librarians to subdue him. The Warhound psychers intervened, using their psychic abilities to calm the Primarch, to suppress the nails' neurological assault long enough for Angron to regain some semblance of control. It was, in retrospect, the last time the librarian would be able to perform this function, because Angron would later ensure that the Legion had no librarians left. The Warhounds were horrified. They had waited for their Primarch with the desperate hope of sons who had grown up without a father, who had built their entire identity around the idea that someday their Gene sire would come and give them purpose and direction, who had dreamed of a leader who would take the raw aggression that defined their Legion and shape it into something greater. Instead, they got Angron, a broken, raging, pain-racked monster who looked at them with eyes full of nothing but contempt and suffering, and who could not, would not, did not have the neurological capacity to feel anything for them except the reflected echo of his own torment. Khorne was the one who reached him. Khorne, who would later become the betrayer, who would later become the greatest mortal champion of Khorne, was at this time the captain of the 8th Company and the closest thing that the 12th Legion had to a voice of reason. Khorne approached the Primarch when no one else would, and the encounter that followed is one of the most significant moments in the 12th Legion's history. The moment that determined whether the World Eaters would exist at all, or whether Angron would simply kill his sons one by one until there were none left. The details of the encounter, drawn from the novel After Deshir and expanded in subsequent heresy fiction, are both harrowing and strangely moving. Angron had withdrawn to a chamber on the flagship, surrounded by the bodies of the World Eaters he had killed during his initial rampage. The Legion's officers had attempted to approach him multiple times, and each approach had ended with another dead World Eater and another failed attempt at communication. The Primarch was in the grip of the nails, raging, incoherent, trapped in a cycle of violence and pain that the unfamiliar environment of the ship and the presence of strangers who claimed to be his sons had amplified to a breaking point. Khorne entered the chamber. He was armed, but he made no move to use his weapon. He spoke to the Primarch, not as a subordinate to a commander, but as one warrior to another, with a directness and a simplicity that cut through the nails' noise in a way that formal military address could not. He acknowledged Angron's pain. He acknowledged the injustice of Nuceria. He offered not loyalty, which Angron had no use for, and not obedience, which Angron could not have valued, but understanding, a simple human understanding that the Primarch standing before him was in pain, and that the pain was not his fault, and that the warhounds, imperfect and limited as they were, wanted to help. Angron did not embrace Khorne. He did not weep. He did not open his heart, because the nails had burned his heart closed decades ago. But he stopped killing. He listened, and in the silence that followed Khorne's words, a silence that the nails filled with their grinding, relentless pain, something that was not quite a relationship but was more than mere tolerance established itself between the Primarch and the captain who had dared to speak to him as a person rather than as a weapon, spoke to him when no one else dared. And somehow, through a combination of courage, persistence, and an intuitive understanding of what the nails were doing to Angron's mind, convinced the Primarch to accept his legion. Not to love them, not to lead them, to accept them, to tolerate their existence, to allow them to fight beside him, to follow him, to serve the function that the Emperor had assigned to them. It was not the relationship that the Warhounds had hoped for. It was the relationship that the nails would permit. Angron renamed the Legion. The Warhounds became the World Eaters, a name that honored Angron's gladiators, who had called themselves the Eaters of Cities. It was a name that reflected what the Legion was about to become. Not warriors, but devourers. Not soldiers, but engines of consumption, taking worlds and leaving nothing behind but blood and silence. And then Angron gave his sons a gift: the butcher's nails. The decision to implant the nails in the 12th Legion is one of the most debated events in the Horus Heresy's history, because it is the moment when the World Eater's fate was sealed, The moment when the Legion crossed from salvageable to damned, the point of no return from which there was no recovery. Angron did not order the implantation, not directly, not in the way that a Primarch typically issued orders to his Legion. What Angron did was worse. He demonstrated. He fought and his sons watched, and they saw what the nails did to him. The speed, the strength, the ferocity, the absolute terrifying commitment to violence that the implants produced. And they saw that the nails were eating him alive, that the implants were slowly destroying his brain, that the agony was consuming what remained of his personality, and they understood, in the way that sons understand, that their father was dying. And they chose to die with him. The World Eaters began to implant themselves with copies of the Butcher's Nails, cruder versions of the archaeotech that had been hammered into Angron's skull, manufactured by the Legion's apothecaries and tech adepts from the fragments of Nucerian technology that Angron had brought with him. The copies were imperfect. They were less sophisticated than Angron's originals. But they worked. They produced the same cycle of pain and relief, the same neurological cage, the same desperate need for violence that characterized their Primarch's existence. The Legion's veterans implanted themselves first, out of loyalty to Angron and the desire to share his burden. Then the younger warriors followed, out of loyalty to their veterans, and the understanding that refusal would mark them as outsiders in a Legion that was rapidly losing its tolerance for dissent. Then the new recruits, who never knew the warhounds, who never experienced the Legion before the nails, who were inducted into a culture of pain and rage and accepted it as normal because it was the only culture they had ever known. The apothecaries who performed the implantation procedure were working with imperfect knowledge and inadequate tools. Angron's nails were Dark Age archaeotech, manufactured with materials and techniques that the Imperium could not replicate. The copies that the Legion's apothecaries produced were cruder, less refined, and in many ways more dangerous than the originals. The surgery was performed without the precision that the original Nucerian surgeons had employed, because the original surgeons had been trained in the use of the archaeotech, and the Legion's apothecaries were improvising based on examination of Angron's implants. The failure rate was significant. Not every Marine survived the implantation. The nails were hammered into the skull, literally hammered. The crude neural connectors forced through bone and into brain tissue with a brutality that was less surgery and more assault. The pain of the procedure was extreme even by Space Marine standards, and the Marines who survived the implantation emerged changed. Their personalities altered. Their capacity for rational thought diminished. Their awareness of their surroundings filtered through the constant grinding pain that the nails produced. Some Marines embraced the change. The aggression felt natural to warriors who had been bred for combat, and the nails' pain, while constant, was manageable for a physiology that had been engineered to withstand injuries that would kill an ordinary human. These Marines became the first true World Eaters, the vanguard of the transformation that would consume the entire Legion. Others fought it. The nails' physical effects were documented by the Legion's apothecaries, and the documentation makes for harrowing reading. The implants released a constant stream of neurochemicals that stimulated the brain's amygdala, the region responsible for processing fear and aggression, while simultaneously suppressing activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, planning, and impulse control. The result was a brain that was permanently in a state of heightened arousal, permanently ready for combat, permanently processing the world through the lens of threat assessment and violent response. The pain was generated by the implant's interaction with the brain's pain centers. The nail's neural connectors, embedded in the somatosensory cortex, produced a steady stream of pain signals that the brain could not ignore, could not adapt to, could not suppress through any natural mechanism. The pain was always there, a background roar of neurological agony that filled every moment of consciousness with a grinding, relentless discomfort that was not quite severe enough to be debilitating, but was far too severe to be tolerable. The only escape was the neurochemical reward that the nails provided during combat. When the bearer fought, when the aggression circuits fired and the adrenaline surged and the killing began, the nails released a flood of endorphins and dopamine that temporarily overwhelmed the pain signals, producing a brief window of relief that was, for the nails bearer, the closest thing to peace that their rewired brain could experience. This reward mechanism was the cage's lock. The nails did not merely inflict pain. They offered relief, and the relief was conditional on violence. And the conditionality created an addiction that was neurological rather than psychological. A physical dependency that the bearer's willpower could resist but never break. A world eater who wanted to stop fighting, who wanted to lay down his chinax and walk away from the killing, would experience a surge of pain so severe that it would incapacitate him, drive him to his knees, fill his consciousness with an agony so overwhelming that the only coherent thought remaining would be the need to make it stop. And the only way to make it stop was to pick up the chinax and find something to kill. The long-term effects of the nails on brain tissue were progressive and irreversible. The implant's neural connectors slowly expanded their reach, burrowing deeper into the brain, colonizing new regions, replacing organic tissue with the metallic tendrils of the archaeotech. Over years and decades, the nails consumed the brain from the inside, eating away at the neural structures that supported personality, memory, and identity, leaving behind a consciousness that was increasingly reduced to the fundamental imperatives of the implants: fight, kill, rage, repeat. Warriors in the early stages of nails degradation retained most of their personality, their memories, their ability to recognize friends and follow orders. Warriors in the middle stages began to lose these capacities, their conversations becoming shorter, their responses becoming more limited, their awareness of their surroundings narrowing to a tunnel vision that focused exclusively on potential targets. Warriors in the late stages were barely functional between engagements, pacing their cells, muttering to themselves, lashing out at anyone who came too close, their consciousness reduced to a flickering ember of awareness surrounded by a roaring fire of rage. The apothecaries who documented these stages did so with a clinical detachment that masked what must have been a profound personal horror. These were medical professionals, trained to preserve life and restore function, watching the warriors they were responsible for deteriorate in real time, knowing that the deterioration was caused by the implants that the apothecaries themselves had installed, and knowing that there was nothing they could do to reverse the process. The nails could not be removed. The degradation could not be slowed. The apothecaries could only document and wait and watch their patients become their subjects. Their brothers become their case studies. Some apothecaries succumb to the nails themselves, their own implants eroding their clinical objectivity, their medical training overwhelmed by the same rage that consumed the warriors they were supposed to treat. An apothecary in the grip of the nails is a particularly disturbing sight. A medical professional with surgical tools in their hands and murder in their eyes. The healer and the killer fused into a single, contradictory entity that the nails' neurological demands resolve in the only way they can, by transforming the healer into the killer entirely. Warriors in the terminal stage were the ones who became the Red Butchers, sealed in their armor, released only for combat, beyond any possibility of recovery or communication. The terminal stage was not death. It was something worse. It was existence without identity, awareness without understanding, life without anything that made life recognizable as life. They felt the nails eroding their personalities, felt the rage building behind their eyes, felt the slow, inexorable loss of the qualities that made them individuals rather than machines, and they resisted. Some managed to develop coping mechanisms, mental disciplines that allowed them to maintain a degree of control over the nails' influence. These were the Marines who retained enough of their original selves to feel horror at what they were becoming. Enough self-awareness to understand that they were losing a battle they could never win. Khorne was one of these. The future betrayer fought the nails harder than anyone in the Legion, maintaining his intelligence, his tactical acumen, his ability to think and plan and communicate through sheer force of will. The effort cost him. Every moment of clarity was purchased at the price of constant internal warfare, a battle between the nails' demands and Khorne's determination to remain himself. The battle would last for 10,000 years, and Khorne would never entirely win it, but he would never entirely lose it either. Not everyone agreed. There was resistance. Centurion Mago attempted to prevent the mass implantation, leading a revolt against what he saw as the destruction of the Legion he had served for decades. Mago's rebellion came to a head on the world of Genna, where Khorne killed the rebel Centurion in combat, and Angron, freshly awakened from a coma during which the young Lexicanium Tethys had attempted to absorb his memories of Nuceria, killed Tethys as well. The rebellion failed. The nails spread through the Legion, and the Warhounds, the disciplined, professional, controlled fighting force that had served the Emperor through the Unification Wars and the early Great Crusade, ceased to exist. What emerged was something different, something broken, something that fought not with controlled aggression but with uncontrolled fury, not with tactical precision but with the screaming, headlong charge of warriors who needed violence the way they needed air, who could not stop fighting because stopping meant the return of the pain, who killed not because the mission required it but because their rewired brains demanded it. The librarians were next. Angron despised psychers. The nails made him vulnerable to psychic abilities. The librarian's calming influence, a reminder of the control that others could exert over him. And the empathic gift that the nails had destroyed was too close to what the librarians represented. Angron gave them a choice. Submit to the nails or die. The librarians who accepted the nails discovered that the implants were incompatible with psychic ability. The nails' neurological rewiring disrupted the psyker's connection to the warp, corrupting their powers, destabilizing their control, turning their psychic gifts into liabilities rather than assets. Every librarian who received the nails lost their abilities. Some died immediately, their brains unable to reconcile the Nails' neural patterns with the psychic architecture that their minds were built around. Others survived but were reduced to ordinary warriors, their psychic potential burned away by the implants. The librarians who refused the Nails were given the alternative, removal of the implants. This was a death sentence, and everyone knew it, because the Emperor's own tech priests had failed to remove Angron's nails, and the copies that the Legion's warriors had received were no less deeply embedded. Every librarian who submitted to removal died. Without exception, the nails could not be taken out without killing the host. The 12th Legion's librarium was destroyed. The last psychers of the World Eaters were either dead, brain damaged, or in hiding, and the Legion was left without the moderating influence that had kept its aggression under control since its founding. The renaming from Warhounds to World Eaters was proposed by Captain Draeger, one of the Legion's officers who recognized that the old name no longer fit the force that Angron was creating. The name World Eaters, a tribute to Angron's gladiators who had called themselves the Eaters of Cities, was adopted by the Legion with an enthusiasm that reflected the growing influence of the Nails on the warrior's self-image. The Warhounds had been named for their loyalty, their pack mentality, their willingness to fight for their masters. The World Eaters were named for their appetite, their hunger, their willingness to consume everything in their path. The Great Crusade continued, and the World Eaters carved a bloody path across the galaxy. They were deployed to the most violent war zones, the planets where resistance was fiercest, and where the objective was annihilation rather than negotiation. They conquered worlds that other legions had declared too costly to assault, breaking through defenses that had withstood conventional attacks by the simple expedient of charging them head-on and accepting whatever casualties the charge produced. The compliance of Jenna was one of the most notorious early actions of the renamed Legion. Genna was the world where Mago's rebellion was crushed, where Khorne killed the last centurion who had tried to prevent the mass implantation of the nails, and where the Warhounds officially died and the World Eaters were born. The compliance was achieved with a level of violence that exceeded even the standards that the World Eaters would later establish, and the Administratum's after-action reports noted, with bureaucratic understatement, that the casualty figures among the non-combatant population were inconsistent with the objectives of the mission. The World Eaters fought on worlds that the law preserves only as names on a list of atrocities. Sarum, Castra, Ulixis, each world a campaign of total war, each engagement a demonstration of what happened when the nails were unleashed on a population that had no means of resistance. The compliance records, the Administratum's dry bureaucratic documentation of each conquest, contain a recurring notation that appears in the World Eaters' files more frequently than in any other legion's excessive casualties among non-combatant population. The notation was the Administratum's way of saying that the World Eaters had killed people who did not need to be killed, in numbers that could not be explained by tactical necessity. The World Eaters' approach to compliance, the Imperial term for the conquest and integration of new worlds, was fundamentally different from other legions, where the Ultramarines conquered and then built, where the Imperial Fists conquered and then fortified, where the Word-Bearers conquered and then converted, the World Eaters conquered and then killed. The killing continued after the resistance ended, after the enemy forces surrendered, after the population accepted Imperial rule. The nails did not recognize surrender. The nails did not recognize the distinction between combatant and civilian. The nails recognized only the need for violence, and the World Eaters, trapped in the nails' cage, satisfied that need on whatever targets were available. Lotara Sarin, the Conqueror's mortal captain, served as a dark mirror to the Legion's transformation. She watched the warriors she commanded degrade year by year, watched the conversations in the mess halls become shorter and more strained, watched the rituals of the dueling pits become less disciplined and more lethal, watched the honor codes that had governed the Warhound's internal culture dissolve into a simple hierarchy of violence. The strongest warrior ruled. The weakest warrior died, and everyone in between competed to avoid being the weakest. Sarin adapted. She maintained her authority through a combination of competence, fearlessness, and the kind of brutal directness that the World Eaters respected. She ran the Conqueror with an iron hand that the nails-driven Marines could understand, communicating in the language of force that was the only language the nails had left them. When a Marine disobeyed, she did not argue. She shot them. When a subordinate challenged her authority, she did not negotiate. She executed them. The World Eaters respected this. They understood force. It was the only thing the nails let them understand. Sarin's fate is one of the Heresy's most haunting loose threads. She commanded the Conqueror through the Great Crusade, through the Heresy, through the Shadow Crusade and the Siege of Terror, maintaining the ship's function while the warriors around her lost everything that made them recognizable as the warhounds she had once served beside. She watched the transformation from the bridge, watching the readouts that showed the crew's vital signs deteriorating, watching the incident reports that documented the increasing frequency of violence between crew members, watching the kill counts that charted the Legion's descent from military force to murder cult. She stayed. Through all of it. She could have transferred. She could have requested reassignment to another ship, another Legion, another part of the fleet where the officers were not slowly going insane. She stayed because the Conqueror was her ship, and the World Eaters were her warriors, and the loyalty that she felt toward them, irrational, self-destructive, ultimately futile, was the mirror image of the loyalty that the Warhounds had felt toward their Primarch. In the end, the lore suggests, Sarin was consumed by the warp energy that suffused the Conqueror during its retreat to the Eye of Terror. The ship itself was changing, its metal warping, its corridors rearranging, the boundary between the vessel and the Imperium becoming fluid and uncertain. Sarin may have merged with the ship. She may have been consumed by it. She may have become the Conqueror, her consciousness integrated into the vessel's systems, her will sustaining the ship long after the crew had lost the capacity to maintain it through conventional means. If this account is true, then Lotara Sarin, the mortal woman who commanded a legion of berserkers through the darkest chapter of the Imperium's history, is still alive, still conscious, still running the Conqueror somewhere in the Eye of Terror, a ghost in the machine of a ship that carries the last remnants of the World Eaters through the warp's eternal madness. It would be fitting. The most loyal servant of the 12th Legion, preserved not in flesh but in metal, not in life but in function, doing her duty aboard a ship that is itself a relic of the Legion she could not save. The practice of taking skulls became the World Eater's most distinctive ritual. After each engagement, the warriors would collect the skulls of their fallen enemies, cleaning them and mounting them on chains, on trophy racks, on the armor itself. The skulls were not merely trophies, they were devotional objects, offerings to Khorne, though the World Eaters did not yet recognize them as such. The blood god's influence on the Legion was growing, subtle and insidious, expressed not as a conscious worship, but as a cultural drift, a gradual alignment of the Legion's values and practices with the demands of a deity that the warriors did not yet know they were serving. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. The words would not be spoken for decades yet, but the behavior that the words described was already the World Eater's defining characteristic. The Great Crusade continued. The World Eaters fought. They fought well, in the narrow sense that they killed enormous numbers of enemies and conquered world after world with a ferocity that no other legion could match. But they fought dirty. They fought without restraint. They fought in ways that made even the other legions that were not squeamish about violence, uncomfortable. The World Eaters did not take prisoners. They did not accept surrenders. They did not distinguish between combatants and civilians. They landed. They charged. They killed everything in their path. And they did not stop until there was nothing left to kill. The nails did not permit stopping. The nails did not permit discrimination. The nails permitted only the red haze, the screaming charge, the chain axe in the hands and the blood on the armor, and the brief intoxicating relief that came with each kill. The World Eaters' kill tallies were staggering. They used a practice called the tithe, counting the skulls of their fallen enemies after each engagement, each warrior competing to add to his personal total. The practice was a holdover from the gladiatorial culture of Nuceria, where a fighter's value was measured in the number of opponents they had killed, and it became the World Eater's primary metric of worth. A warrior's rank, his status within the Legion, his access to equipment and assignments, was determined not by tactical acumen or leadership ability, but by his kill count. This transformed the World Eater's combat doctrine in subtle but profound ways. Warriors who were rewarded for individual kills began to prioritize personal combat over team coordination. The disciplined formations that the warhounds had used to devastating effect gave way to massed charges, each warrior racing to reach the enemy first, to claim the first kill, to add to the count that defined their worth. Tactical objectives became secondary to the accumulation of skulls, and commanders who attempted to maintain discipline found themselves overruled by warriors whose nails-driven fury could not be redirected once the charge began. The transformation of the World Eater's combat culture from disciplined aggression to uncontrolled fury happened gradually over decades of the Great Crusade, and watching it unfold through the accounts of the warriors who lived through it is like watching a time-lapse of decay. In the early years after the nail's introduction, the World Eaters retained much of their original discipline. The nails were new. The warriors who carried them were still learning to manage the pain, still developing the mental techniques that allowed them to function between engagements, still capable of the rational thought that tactical coordination required. The charges were aggressive, yes, the killing was intense. But the attacks were directed, aimed at objectives, terminated when the objectives were achieved. A commander could still issue orders and expect them to be followed. As the years passed, the balance shifted. The nails ate deeper into the warriors' brains, degrading the neural tissue that supported higher cognitive function, eroding the capacity for the kind of complex thought that tactical discipline required. Warriors who had once been able to control the rage between engagements found the control slipping. the red haze descending more frequently, the periods of clarity between episodes growing shorter. Warriors who had once fought with purpose began to fight with compulsion, the nails driving them toward violence regardless of whether violence served any strategic aim. The transformation was most visible in the transition periods between engagements. In the early years, the World Eaters between battles were recognizable as Space Marines, disciplined, controlled, capable of conversation and planning and the normal social interactions that defined life in a Space Marine legion. In the later years, the World Eaters between battles were barely contained, pacing the corridors of their ships like caged animals, the nails pounding in their skulls, the rage building with every moment of inactivity, until the next engagement came and the rage could be released and the brief, blessed relief of violence could wash away the pain. The Conqueror, the World Eater's flagship, became a reflection of the Legion's transformation. The warship, a modified Gloriana-class battleship, was captained by Lutara Sarin, one of the few non-Astartes officers who could function in the World Eater's increasingly deranged command structure. Sarin was feared even by the World Eaters, a mortal woman whose force of personality was strong enough to maintain discipline among genetically enhanced berserkers. And the respect the Legion showed her was one of the last remnants of the Warhound's original culture. Sarin held the Conqueror together through the Great Crusade and the Heresy, managing the ship's operations while the Marines around her lost their minds to the nails. She shot the World Eater Centurion Delvarus in the face for abandoning his station during a battle, and Delvarus, a berserker who had killed more enemies than most Marines would face in a lifetime, went to his quarters rather than risk her anger. That a single mortal woman could command such respect from a legion of brain-damaged berserkers is one of the few moments of dark humor in the World Eater's otherwise unrelenting tragedy. Other Primarchs noticed. Robut Guilliman, the Lord of Ultramar, confronted Angron about the World Eater's methods and was nearly killed for his trouble. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, fought Angron to a standstill in a confrontation that was, depending on who tells the story, either a disciplinary action ordered by the Emperor or a territorial dispute between two Primarchs who were too proud to back down. The Emperor himself is said to have censured the World Eaters on at least one occasion, though the details of the censure and its effect on Angron's behavior vary between accounts. Guilliman's confrontation with Angron is documented in fragmentary accounts, but the essence is clear. The Lord of Ultramar, the most methodical and rational of the Primarchs, attempted to reason with a being whose capacity for reason had been surgically removed. Guilliman spoke of duty, of honor, of the legacy that the Emperor intended the legions to build. Angron heard noise. The nails heard noise, and the rage that boiled up in response to Guilliman's words, the fury of being lectured by a Primarch who had grown up in comfort and privilege and who had never felt the nails bite, nearly resulted in Guilliman's death on the spot. Russ's confrontation was different. The Wolf King did not come to lecture. He came to fight. Leman Russ challenged Angron to a duel, and the two Primarchs fought, and the fight was savage, a clash of two of the most physically powerful beings in the galaxy. The accounts disagree on who won. Russ's supporters claim that the Wolf King was winning the tactical engagement, that he had Angron off balance, and was about to land a decisive blow. Angron supporters, such as they are, claim that the Red Angel was overwhelming the Wolf King with pure fury, and that Russ retreated before the fight was decided. The truth is probably that neither Primarch won, because the fight was broken up before a conclusion could be reached. But the confrontation revealed something important about the difference between Russ and Angron. Russ fought with controlled aggression, channeling his considerable fury into tactical movement and calculated strikes. Angron fought with uncontrolled rage, swinging wildly, sacrificing defense for offense, taking wounds that would have killed a lesser being in order to land blows of his own. Russ was a wolf. Angron was a storm, and a storm cannot be defeated by a wolf. But a storm also cannot be directed, cannot be aimed, cannot be used for any purpose other than destruction. This was the Emperor's dilemma. Angron was the most powerful assault weapon in the Imperium's arsenal. He was also the least controllable. The nails made him devastating in combat and useless in every other context. He could not be reasoned with, could not be directed, could not be trusted to pursue strategic objectives when the nails were driving him toward the nearest enemy, regardless of whether that enemy was strategically significant. He was a weapon without a safety, a gun that fired in whatever direction it happened to be pointing. And the Emperor's inability to remove the nails or control their effects meant that Angron would remain this way for the rest of his existence. The Emperor's response to this dilemma was characteristically pragmatic and characteristically cold. He deployed the World Eaters to war zones where their uncontrolled fury was an asset rather than a liability, where the objective was total destruction rather than measured conquest, where there were no civilians to protect and no infrastructure to preserve. He used Angron the way Nuceria's High Riders had used Angron, as a weapon. A tool, a device for producing violence, pointed at the enemy and released. The irony was vicious. The Emperor had found Angron on a world where he was a slave, and the Emperor had freed him from that world, and then the Emperor had put him to work as a weapon, which was exactly what the High Riders had done. The chains were different. The collar was different. The arena was bigger, stretching across the galaxy rather than across a Nucerian fighting pit. But the fundamental relationship was identical, a being of immense power, treated as a tool, valued only for the violence he could produce, denied the autonomy and the connection that might have made the violence bearable. Angron noticed the parallel. The nails made it impossible for him to articulate the insight in any sophisticated way, but the raw understanding was there. The Emperor was doing to him what the High Riders had done, using him, exploiting his capacity for violence while ignoring his capacity for everything else, treating him as a weapon rather than a person. The irony was not lost on Angron, even through the nails' neurological fog. The Emperor, who claimed to be building a civilization of freedom and enlightenment, was doing exactly what the slave masters of Nuceria had done. The details were different. The chains were more elegant, but the relationship was the same. None of it mattered. The nails did not respond to censure. The nails did not respect chain of command. The nails cared about one thing: the next kill. And the World Eaters, trapped in the nails' cage, followed their Primarch into deeper and deeper levels of brutality. Not because they chose to, but because the implants in their skulls would not let them choose anything else. The Horus Heresy began with the War Master's fall to chaos, and the World Eaters followed Horus into rebellion with an enthusiasm that was, in retrospect, inevitable. The path from loyal legion to traitor force was, for the World Eaters, the shortest of any of the 9 legions that joined Horus. The other traitor Primarchs had complex motivations. Horus was corrupted by the Chaos Gods through a combination of poisoning, manipulation, and the exploitation of his existing doubts. Magnus the Red fell through the consequences of his own arrogance and the Imperium's hypocrisy regarding psychic power. Mortarion was broken by captivity and disease. Lorgar was driven to chaos by a crisis of faith. Fulgrim was possessed by a daemon sword. Perturabo was consumed by resentment. Alfarius's motivations remain unknown. Conrad Curzay was simply insane. Angron's motivation was simpler than any of these. Angron hated the Emperor. He had hated the Emperor since the moment the Emperor ripped him from Nuceria's surface and left his gladiators to die. He had hated the Emperor through every year of the Great Crusade, through every campaign, through every censure, through every moment that the Imperium treated him as a weapon rather than a person. The hatred was not political. It was not philosophical. It was personal, visceral, rooted in a wound that the nails would never let him forget. When Horus offered rebellion, Angron did not need to be persuaded. He did not need to be corrupted. He did not need to weigh the arguments or consider the consequences or consult with his advisors. The decision was instantaneous. There was no deliberation, no weighing of consequences, no moral calculus. The nails did not permit moral calculus. What the nails permitted was the recognition that Horus's offer meant more fighting, more killing, more of the only experience that provided relief from the constant grinding agony that had been Angron's existence since the day the implants were hammered into his skull on Nuceria. He said yes, because yes meant war, and war meant violence, and violence meant the brief, temporary relief from the nails' pain that was the only pleasure his rewired brain could experience. Angron did not join the rebellion because he was corrupted by chaos. Angron joined because Horus offered him the one thing he had always wanted: war without limits, war without rules, war without the Emperor's censure, without the administratum's quotas, without the endless, grinding bureaucracy of a galactic empire that demanded obedience from a being whose neural architecture was incapable of obeying. Horus promised Angron that the World Eaters could fight and kill without restraint, without consequence, without the hypocrisy of an emperor who claimed to be building a civilization of peace while deploying legions of killing machines to achieve it. And Angron, whose capacity for complex moral reasoning had been burned away by the nails decades earlier, accepted. The World Eaters were deployed to Istvan III for the first act of the heresy's betrayal. Istvan III was where Horus purged the loyalist elements from the traitor legions, landing the warriors he could not trust on the planet's surface, and then bombing them from orbit with virus weapons, annihilating his own soldiers to ensure that the legions he led into rebellion were composed entirely of warriors who would follow him without question. The World Eaters' loyalists, the warriors who had not fully embraced the nails, who retained enough of their original personalities to question Angron's judgment, were among those sent to die on Istvan III. They fought against their own brothers, World Eater against World Eater, in a fratricide that should have horrified a legion with any remaining capacity for horror. The nails ensured that it did not. The loyalists died. The traitors barely noticed, because the nails did not distinguish between allies and enemies. Blood was blood, skulls were skulls. The nails cared only that the killing continued. The loyalist World Eaters who fought on Istvan III were led by Captain Earlon, one of the last officers who had served in the Warhounds before Angron's arrival. Earlon and his fellow loyalists fought with the discipline that the Warhounds had been known for. using coordinated tactics and controlled aggression against their own brothers who came at them in the screaming, uncoordinated charges that the Nails demanded. For a brief, terrible period, the Battle of Istvan III demonstrated the difference between what the Warhounds had been and what the World Eaters had become. The Loyalists, fighting with discipline and purpose, held their positions against superior numbers of Nails-driven berserkers. They held because they remembered what they were. They fought as Warhounds, not as World Eaters, using the tactics and formations that the Legion had developed before Angron's arrival, and those tactics proved superior to the mindless charges of their Nails-driven brothers. It was a final, futile validation of everything the Warhounds had stood for, a demonstration that the old ways worked. That discipline was more effective than rage, that a warrior who could think was more dangerous than a warrior who could only scream. There is a story, unconfirmed but persistent in the lore, that some Warhounds survived, not on Istvan III, where the Loyalists were overwhelmed and killed, but elsewhere, in the wider galaxy, where individual World Eaters who had been seconded to other forces, who had been assigned to garrison duties or training missions or administrative postings far from the Legion's main fleet, heard the news of the heresy and faced a choice. Some joined the traitors. The pull of the Legion, the bond of gene seed, the loyalty to brothers even over the loyalty to the Emperor, drew them back to the 12th, and they submitted to the Nails and the madness and the blood. Others did not. These were the Warhounds who remembered what the 12th had been before Angron, who had not yet received the Nails, who had maintained the discipline and the culture that the old Legion had valued. These loyalist Warhounds faced a uniquely cruel fate. They were hunted by both sides. The traitors hunted them as enemies. The loyalists hunted them as traitors, because the Imperium could not distinguish between the World Eaters who had turned against the Emperor and the Warhounds who had not. The 12th Legion was declared traitor in its entirety, and every warrior who bore its gene seed was marked for death. Some of these loyalist Warhounds survived by going to ground, by hiding their identities, by joining other forces under false names. Others fought their way to loyalist lines and offered their service to the Emperor, proving their loyalty through action when their Legion's reputation made words meaningless. A very few, are rumored to have been taken in by the Inquisition, their knowledge of the World Eaters' tactics and the Nails' effects too valuable to waste. Their loyalty verified through the kind of invasive, brutal interrogation that the Inquisition considers standard operating procedure. These loyalist Warhounds, if they existed, if any of them survived the heresy and its aftermath, are the last echoes of the Legion that Angron destroyed. The last carriers of the Warhounds' culture, their honor codes, their disciplined aggression, their capacity for the kind of brotherhood that the Nails consumed. The Imperium does not acknowledge them. The official history records the 12th Legion as traitor, without exception, without qualification. The Warhounds are a footnote in a story that the Imperium would rather forget, a reminder that the Legion that became the galaxy's most feared berserkers was once something different, something better. Something that the Emperor's own choices helped to destroy. The Loyalists were destroyed anyway, overwhelmed by sheer numbers and by the orbital bombardment that Horus ordered when the ground forces could not finish the job quickly enough. But they died fighting, and they died as Warhounds, and in the annals of the 12th Legion's history, their last stand on Istvan III is the final chapter of the Legion that Angron destroyed. Istvan V followed. The Dropsite Massacre. The traitor legions annihilated 3 loyal legions in a carefully planned ambush. and the World Eaters were at the forefront of the assault, charging into the Loyalist lines with the screaming headlong fury that had become their signature. The Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and the Iron Hands were broken, their Primarchs killed or nearly killed, their legions reduced to fragments. Angron hunted the survivors personally. For 98 days after the Dropsite massacre, the World Eaters pursued the remnants of the Raven Guard across Istvan V, running them to ground in a cat-and-mouse campaign that ended only when a relief force of Raven Guard arrived and extracted their Primarch Korax from the planet. The World Eaters' role in the wider heresy was not limited to set-piece battles. Between the major engagements, the 12th Legion waged a campaign of devastation across the galaxy that left a swathe of destroyed worlds in its wake. Angron did not care about Horus's strategic objectives. He did not care about the War Master's plans for Terra, about the political dimensions of the rebellion, about the complex web of alliances and betrayals that the other Primarchs were navigating. Angron cared about killing. The Nails cared about killing. And the World Eaters, trapped in the Nails' neurological cage, killed with an enthusiasm that made even the other traitor legions uncomfortable. The War Master used this to his advantage. Horus was a strategist of extraordinary ability, and he understood that the World Eaters, while uncontrollable in the conventional sense, could be directed in the way that a natural disaster can be directed, by putting obstacles in its path and letting it destroy them. Horus pointed the World Eaters at the targets he wanted destroyed, and then got out of the way, letting the 12th Legion's Nails-driven fury do what conventional tactics could not. The tactic worked. Worlds that had resisted other traitor forces fell to the World Eaters in hours. Fortifications that had withstood weeks of siege were breached by berserker charges that accepted casualties that no rational commander would authorize. The World Eaters were the hammer that Horus used to crack the hardest nuts, the blunt instrument that the War Master deployed when subtlety had failed and sheer overwhelming violence was the only remaining option. The cost was staggering. The World Eaters took casualties at a rate that would have destroyed any other legion, losing warriors in every engagement, burning through their strength with a profligacy that reflected their total disregard for self-preservation. The Nails did not permit self-preservation. The Nails demanded the charge, the impact, the kill, and the warriors who obeyed the Nails' demands died in numbers that steadily depleted the 12th Legion's fighting strength. By the time the heresy reached its climax at Terra, the World Eaters were a fraction of their former size. The tens of thousands who had begun the rebellion had been reduced to a core of hardened Nails-ravaged berserkers, who were individually the most dangerous close combat fighters in the galaxy, but who lacked the numbers to sustain the kind of prolonged campaign that the Siege of Terra demanded. They did not care. The Nails did not permit caring about numbers. The Nails permitted only the charge. Then came the Shadow Crusade. The Shadow Crusade was Lorgar's plan, though Angron did not know this and would not have cared if he had. Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, invited Angron to join him in a campaign against Ultramar, the domain of Robut Guillimon, and Angron accepted with the same uncomplicated enthusiasm that he brought to every opportunity for violence. The Shadow Crusade was a joint offensive by the World Eaters and the Word-Bearers into the 500 worlds of Ultramar, and it was devastating. The World Eaters and the Word-Bearers laid waste to 26 worlds in rapid succession, slaughtering entire populations, burning cities, and reducing the most prosperous region of the Imperium to a smoking ruin. Angron did not know that Lorgar had an ulterior motive. The word-bearer's Primarch had been planning something far more significant than mere conquest. Lorgar intended to use the bloodshed and the suffering generated by the Shadow Crusade to fuel a ritual, a sorcerous working that would transform Angron into something greater and something worse than a Primarch. The Shadow Crusade was not merely a campaign of destruction. It was a partnership between two Primarchs who could not have been more different, and the dynamic between Angron and Lorgar is one of the most fascinating relationships in the entire heresy. Lorgar was everything that Angron was not. Where Angron was direct, Lorgar was subtle. Where Angron was driven by rage, Lorgar was driven by faith. Where Angron sought only the next kill, Lorgar sought meaning, purpose. The answer to questions that Angron's nails damaged brain could no longer formulate. They should have been incompatible. Instead, they developed something that was, by the standards of the Primarchs, almost a friendship. Lorgar saw in Angron a brother who was suffering, and the word-bearer's Primarch, whose entire identity was built around the need to believe in something greater than himself, could not simply watch that suffering without trying to address it. Lorgar studied the nails. He consulted with the warp entities who whispered to him. He searched for a solution to the problem that the Emperor had declared unsolvable, because Lorgar was a zealot, and zealots do not accept that problems are unsolvable. The answer Lorgar found was daemonhood. Transform Angron into a daemon prince, a being sustained by the warp's infinite energy rather than by the failing biological machinery that the nails were slowly destroying. The nails would no longer matter, because the daemon's body would not have the neural limitations that the nails exploited. The pain would end. The rage would remain, because Khorne demanded rage, but the pain, the grinding, ceaseless neurological torture that had defined Angron's existence since Nuceria would be gone. Lorgar believed he was saving his brother. The lore is clear on this point. In the novel Betrayer, Lorgar makes it explicit. He genuinely believed that the ritual of ascension was an act of mercy, the only mercy available in a universe that had never shown Angron any other kind. Whether he was right is a question that the lore does not definitively answer. The daemon that Angron became is powerful beyond mortal comprehension, a manifestation of Khorne's fury given form and purpose. But it is also a prisoner, bound to Khorne's will, unable to act independently of the blood god's desires. Unable to choose, unable to refuse, unable to do anything except rage and kill for eternity. The nail's cage was replaced by a larger one. The pain is gone. The chains remain. During the Shadow Crusade, the World Eaters assaulted Armatura, the great war world of Ultramar, a planet that served as the Ultramarines' primary military training facility. The battle was devastating. The World Eaters and the Word Bearers destroyed the planet's defenses, killed its garrison, and reduced its facilities to rubble. The loss of Armatura was a significant blow to the Ultramarines' military capability, and it demonstrated that the Shadow Crusade was not merely a rampage, but a strategic campaign with real objectives and real consequences. But Angron did not care about strategic objectives. Angron cared about killing. The nails cared about killing. And when the Shadow Crusade's trajectory brought the combined fleet to a world that Angron recognized, a world that burned in his memory like a brand that the nails would never let him forget, the strategic objectives became irrelevant. The Shadow Crusade led the two legions to Nuceria, Angron's homeworld, the world that had enslaved him, implanted him with the nails, and killed the only people he had ever loved. When Angron learned what the legends of Nuceria said about him, that the High Riders had told their people that the gladiator slave had fled from battle like a coward, abandoning his comrades to save himself, the rage that consumed him was beyond anything the nails had previously produced. This was not the nails' pain-driven fury. This was personal. This was the rage of a man who has been told that his greatest moment of courage, his willingness to die alongside his brothers, has been rewritten by his enemies as an act of cowardice. Angron gave a single order: kill everything. Every man, woman, and child on Nuceria. Every High Rider. Every slave. Every living thing on the planet that had taken his gladiators from him and then lied about it to the generations that followed. The World Eaters obeyed. They descended on Nuceria like a plague, killing with a ferocity that exceeded even their usual standards, and the killing was absolute. The population of an entire world was exterminated, city by city, settlement by settlement, person by person, until Nuceria was a charnel world of blood and silence. And while the killing continued, Lorgar began his ritual. The word-bearer's Primarch had prepared for this moment. He had studied the texts. He had consulted with the daemons who whispered to him from the warp. He had planned the ritual that would save his brother, because Lorgar, for all his faults, genuinely believed that what he was doing was an act of mercy. The nails were killing Angron. The implants were eating into his brain, destroying neural tissue faster than even the Primarch's enhanced physiology could repair it. Angron was dying, slowly but inevitably, and the only force in the universe that could sustain a consciousness beyond the death of its physical brain was the power of the Chaos Gods. Lorgar's ritual would transform Angron into a daemon prince of Khorne. It was, from Lorgar's perspective, the only way to save his brother. From any other perspective, it was the final destruction of everything that Angron had ever been. Robert Guilliman arrived with the Ultramarines and attempted to stop the ritual. He fought his way through the World Eaters and the Word-Bearers, driving toward the ritual site with the desperate determination of a Primarch who understood what was about to happen, and who knew that if he failed, the consequences would echo through the galaxy for millennia. He failed. Angron and Guilliman fought. The duel between the two Primarchs was brutal, devastating, and one-sided. Angron, driven by the nails and the rage of Nuceria, and the warp energy that was already beginning to flow into him from Lorgar's ritual, overwhelmed Guilliman with a ferocity that the Lord of Ultramar could not match. Guilliman was beaten. Not killed, but beaten, driven back, forced to retreat from Nuceria with the knowledge that he had failed to prevent what was coming. The slaughter of Nuceria lasted 6 days. 6 days in which the World Eaters and the Word-Bearers systematically exterminated the population of an entire planet, killing not just the High Riders who had enslaved Angron, but every living thing on the world. The slaves were killed alongside their masters. The children died beside their parents. The innocents perished with the guilty, because Angron's rage made no distinctions, because the nails did not permit the kind of nuanced moral calculus that would have separated the oppressors from the oppressed. It was the most complete genocide that the 12th Legion had ever committed, and it was committed against the world that had made Angron what he was, the world that had given him the nails and the rage, and the broken mind that could conceive of no response to injustice except total annihilation. Nuceria had created Angron, Angron destroyed Nuceria. The symmetry was not justice, it was not vengeance. It was the closing of a circle that had been drawn in blood on the day the nails were first hammered into a child's skull. Guilliman arrived on the 6th day. The Ultramarines' fleet entered Nucerian space and immediately engaged the traitor forces. Guilliman's tactical precision finding purchase in the chaos of the orbital battle. The Ultramarines landed ground forces, and the Lord of Ultramar himself led the assault toward the ritual site where Lorgar was conducting the ceremony that would transform Angron. The battle between Angron and Guilliman on Nucerian soil was among the most significant Primarch versus Primarch engagements of the entire heresy. Guilliman was one of the finest tactical minds in the Imperium, a warrior of extraordinary skill and intelligence, who had never lost a battle that he had personally directed. But Guilliman was fighting on ground that was soaked in Angron's grief, on a world that was fueling the Red Angel's rage with the memories of everything it had taken from him, and the fury that Angron brought to the fight was beyond anything that tactical skill could counter. Angron beat Guilliman. The Lord of Ultramar fought with everything he had, employing the kind of measured, disciplined combat technique that should have been able to contain a berserker's rage. But Angron was not merely a berserker. He was a Primarch in the grip of a rage that was 10,000 times amplified by the nails and the memories and the warp energy that was already flowing into him from Lorgar's ritual. Guilliman was outmatched not in skill but in sheer, uncontainable fury, and the fury drove him back, drove him to his knees, drove him off the field in a retreat that was, for the Lord of Ultramar, the most bitter tactical withdrawal of his career. The ritual completed, the warp energy flowed into Angron, and the Primarch's body began to change. He grew, his flesh warped, his bones elongated, wings erupted from his back, his face, already twisted by decades of the nails' damage, transformed into something that was no longer human, no longer Primarch, but daemon. Angron ascended. The Red Angel became a daemon prince of Khorne, a being of immense power bound to the will of the blood god, sustained by the warp's energy, immortal, invincible, and completely, irrevocably lost. The person that Angron had been, the slave who had fought for his freedom, the gladiator who had dug his own grave rather than submit, the father who had broken his sons because his own brokenness could not tolerate their wholeness, was consumed by the transformation. What remained was rage given form, violence incarnate, a daemon engine of destruction that served Khorne's hunger for blood and skulls with the mindless, all-consuming fury that the nails had always demanded, and that the daemon's nature now provided in infinite supply. The World Eaters watched their father ascend and felt nothing but the nails' pain. Because the nails did not permit wonder. The nails did not permit grief. The nails permitted only the rage. And the rage was all they had left. The World Eaters fought on through the Horus Heresy, joining the assault on Terror itself, charging the walls of the Imperial Palace with the same screaming, headlong fury that had characterized every engagement since the nails were implanted. They were among the most devastating forces in the traitor army, their berserker charges breaking through defensive lines that more disciplined troops could not have penetrated, their chinaxes carving through the loyalist defenders with a ferocity that turned entire sections of the palace's fortifications into abattoirs. The World Eaters at the Siege of Terror were the most feared element of the traitor forces. The other traitor legions, the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's Children, the Death Guard, the Iron Warriors, fought with varying degrees of tactical sophistication. The Iron Warriors built siege lines. The Sons of Horus coordinated combined arms operations. The Death Guard advanced through biological warfare. The World Eaters simply charged. They hit the walls of the Imperial Palace like a tidal wave of ceramite and chain-edged weapons, slamming into the Loyalist defensive positions with a fury that overwhelmed fortifications designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The World Eaters did not use siege equipment. They did not employ artillery or sappers, or any of the methodical approaches that the other traitor legions used to crack the palace's defenses. The Chinax is the World Eaters' signature weapon and their most enduring cultural artifact. Where other legions favored bolt pistols, power swords, thunder hammers, or the countless other weapons in the Space Marine arsenal, the World Eaters adopted the Chinax as their primary melee weapon and made it the symbol of everything they represented. The Chinax is not a sophisticated weapon. It is a heavy double-bladed axe with motorized chains running along its cutting edges. Chains whose teeth are designed to catch on armor, bite into ceramite, and rip through the target's body with a tearing, grinding action that produces damage far more devastating than a clean cut. The weapon is loud, it is messy, it is brutal in a way that reflects the legion that wields it. Not elegant, not precise, not refined, but overwhelmingly effective at the one thing it is designed to do, which is to kill at close range with the maximum possible amount of violence. Gorechild and Gorefather, Angron's matched pair of chain axes, set the standard for the Legion's weapons. These were no ordinary chain axes. Their teeth were made from the enamel of mica dragons, creatures from a world the World Eaters had conquered, and the resulting cutting edges were harder, sharper, and more durable than anything that conventional materials could produce. The weapons became icons, representations of the Primarch's fury given physical form, and the World Eaters who crafted their own Chinaxes in imitation of Angron's pair were expressing a devotion that went beyond mere weapons preference and into the territory of religious observance. The World Eaters' combat style evolved around the Chinax. Their charges were designed to close the distance between the warrior and the target as quickly as possible, minimizing the time spent in the killing zone of enemy ranged weapons and maximizing the time spent at melee range, where the Chinax could do its work. The warriors fought with a commitment that other legions found both impressive and terrifying. A World Eater who charged did not stop for any reason, did not take cover, did not assess the tactical situation, did not consider the possibility that the charge might fail. The warrior charged. The Chinax swung. The enemy died or the warrior died. There was no middle ground. This commitment was the Nail's doing, but it was also an evolution of the Warhound's original assault doctrine, pushed to its absolute extreme by the implant's neurological demands. The Warhounds had valued the charge. The World Eaters were enslaved to it. The difference between valuing a tactic and being compelled to use it regardless of circumstances is the difference between a warrior and a weapon, and the World Eaters had crossed that line so long ago that most of them could no longer remember which side they had started on. They used bodies. They used rage. They used the Nail's relentless, pain-driven need for violence to turn their warriors into living battering rams who threw themselves at the walls with a ferocity that the defenders had never encountered and could not adequately prepare for. The casualty rates were appalling even by the standards of the siege. For every World Eater who reached the top of the wall, 3 or 4 died on the approach. cut down by bolter fire and lust cannon blasts and the withering defensive fire that the loyalist forces poured into the charging berserkers. The World Eaters did not care. The nails did not permit them to care. They climbed over the bodies of their fallen brothers and kept charging. And when they reached the walls, when they finally came to grips with the loyalist defenders in the close quarters fighting that the nails craved, the killing was beyond description. The World Eaters turned entire sections of the Imperial Palace into charnel houses. The corridors ran with blood. The floor was carpeted with the dead and the dying. The noise, the screaming of the nails-driven berserkers and the war cries of the loyalist defenders, and the grinding of chainswords through ceramite and the wet terminal sounds of flesh being parted from bone, was audible from sectors away. Angron fought on the walls. The daemon Primarch, massive, weak, wreathed in the warp energy that Lorgar's ritual had infused into his body, tore through the loyalist defenders with a power that made even his own berserkers look restrained by comparison. Where Angron fought, the defenses crumbled. Where Angron walked, the dead piled high. The daemon Primarch was, in those final hours of the siege, the single most destructive force on the battlefield. A one-being army whose violence was so extreme that the loyalist forces diverted entire companies to contain him. They could not contain him. They could slow him. They could redirect him. They could sacrifice units to absorb his fury while other sections of the defense were reinforced. But they could not stop him, because Angron was no longer a Primarch. He was a daemon, sustained by the warp, powered by Khorne's hunger, and the blood god's hunger in those final hours of the siege was infinite. Khorne fought at the forefront. The former equerry, the one-time voice of reason in a legion that had lost all capacity for reason, had been consumed by the nails as thoroughly as any of his brothers. He fought on the walls of the inner palace, cutting his way through loyalist space marines, Imperial army soldiers, and anything else that got in his path. And he did not stop until his body could not physically continue. When the heresy ended, when Horus was killed by the Emperor and the traitor forces retreated from Terra, Khorne was found on a mound of corpses. His body was broken, his armor shattered, his wounds so severe that the World Eaters who found him assumed he was dead. He was not dead. Khorne, or the relentless force of Khorne's own will, or the nails' refusal to allow their bearer the mercy of death, kept him alive. The World Eaters carried his shattered body back to their ships and discovered, to their astonishment and their terror, that the greatest berserker in the Legion was still breathing. The World Eaters fled Terra with the rest of the traitor forces, retreating into the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift that the Chaos Legions used as their refuge in the centuries after the heresy. They needed a homeworld. They needed a base of operations, a place from which to rebuild and to launch future campaigns against the Imperium that had defeated them. The retreat from Terra was a nightmare. The World Eaters, who had spent the last weeks in a state of continuous combat, who had not stopped fighting since the first charge at the palace walls, were now expected to withdraw, to retreat, to stop killing and board their ships and leave. The nails did not want to leave. The nails wanted to keep fighting. The pain of withdrawal, the neurological punishment that the nails inflicted when the killing stopped, hit the entire Legion simultaneously. a wave of agony that turned the retreat into a stumbling, screaming exodus of berserkers who could barely function and who attacked anything that moved, including each other. Getting the World Eaters off Terra required the intervention of officers who still retained enough cognitive function to direct the withdrawal. Warriors like Khorne, whose iron will kept the Nails' demands at bay long enough to organize the boarding of dropships and the transfer to the fleet. Even so, the retreat cost the World Eaters hundreds of additional casualties. Marines who were too far gone in the Nails' grip to respond to orders, and who were left behind on Terra's surface, still fighting, still screaming, until the Loyalist forces found them and put them down. The flight to the Eye of Terror was a journey through madness. The World Eaters' ships, crewed by warriors whose neural implants were driving them toward violence in every waking moment, were floating powder kegs. Fights broke out constantly. Crew members were killed by their own comrades. The apothecaries, those who still had enough cognitive function to perform their duties, struggled to maintain the Legion's medical systems while the patients they were treating tried to kill them with whatever was within reach. Angron had already withdrawn from the Legion. The Daemon Primarch, newly ascended, had little use for the mortal warriors who bore his gene seed. He disappeared into the warp, following Khorne's call, pursuing whatever purpose the blood god had assigned to his newest daemon prince. The World Eaters were left leaderless, bereft of the father who had broken them, and who could not even be bothered to stay and watch the aftermath of his destruction. The Legion needed a homeworld. Without a base of operations, without a planet to call their own, the World Eaters would be nomads, wandering the Eye of Terror in ships that were falling apart, crewed by warriors who were falling apart, pursuing a purpose that was falling apart. They found Scalathrax. The Battle of Scalathrax is the defining event of the World Eaters' post-heresy history, and it was caused by Khorne. Scalathrax was a daemon world deep in the Eye of Terror, and the World Eaters fought the Emperor's children there for control of the planet. The battle was fierce. The Emperor's children's noise marines holding the World Eaters at bay with their devastating sonic weapons, and as night fell on Scalathrax, the temperature dropped to levels that would kill even a space marine exposed to the elements for too long. Both legions retreated to their shelters to wait out the frozen night. This was tactically sensible. This was the correct decision. Khorne did not agree. Khorne fell into a rage that exceeded even the Nails' usual fury. He seized a flamer and marched through the World Eaters' lines, torching their shelters, burning his own brothers out of their cover, forcing them into the killing cold. Those who tried to stop him were cut down with Gorechild, the Chinax that had once been Angron's own weapon. Khorne did not discriminate. He killed World Eaters and Emperor's children with equal enthusiasm, carving his way through both legions in a one-man campaign of destruction that lasted through the frozen night. By dawn, the World Eaters were shattered. The legion that had survived the heresy, that had fought its way off Terror and retreated into the Eye of Terror, was broken into hundreds of scattered warbands, each one following its own champion, each one fighting for itself rather than for the Legion. The World Eaters would never reunite as a cohesive force again. The aftermath of Scalathrax was the death of the World Eaters as a legion. In the weeks and months that followed, the surviving World Eaters scattered across the Eye of Terror, each warband following whatever champion had emerged from the chaos of that night, with enough authority or enough violence to command obedience. Some warbands settled on daemon worlds, carving out territories in the warp-saturated hellscapes that populated the Eye. Others remained nomadic, roaming from world to world, system to system, killing whatever they found, driven by the Nail's relentless demand for violence. The Legion Wars that followed the Heresy's conclusion were a period of sustained internecine conflict among the traitor legions within the Eye of Terror. The 9 traitor legions, driven into the warp by their defeat at Terror, turned on each other with a ferocity that matched anything they had directed at the Imperium. The World Eaters were in the thick of these wars, fighting the Emperor's children on Scalathrax, fighting the Iron Warriors over territory, fighting the Night Lords over resources, fighting anyone and everyone who crossed their path, because the Nails demanded combat and the Eye of Terror provided no shortage of opponents. The World Eater's fragmentation during this period was both a weakness and a strange form of strength. A unified legion could be targeted, surrounded, and destroyed. A scattered swarm of independent warbands could not be targeted because there was no single target, could not be surrounded because the warbands were everywhere, and could not be destroyed because destroying one warband had no effect on the others. The warbands that survived the Legion Wars were the ones that were too aggressive to be cornered and too mobile to be pinned down. They moved constantly, never staying in one location long enough for an enemy to mass forces against them, striking at targets of opportunity, consuming resources from the worlds and installations they raided, and moving on before the defenders could organize a response. Individual warbands developed distinct identities over the millennia, each one reflecting the personality of its champion and the particular flavor of madness that the Nails imposed on its warriors. The Skull Takers, led by a champion known only by that name, specialized in attacking heavily defended positions, seeking the most dangerous targets on the battlefield, because the Nail's reward was proportional to the intensity of the combat. The Skull Takers sought out the hardest fights, because the hardest fights provided the greatest relief from the Nail's pain, and the warband's casualty rate reflected this preference. They were constantly losing warriors, and constantly replenishing their numbers from the populations of the worlds they conquered. The berserkers of Scalathrax, a warband that took its name from the world that broke the Legion, were notorious even among the World Eaters for their inability to distinguish between friend and foe. The warband's Nail's degradation had progressed to the point where the warriors could not recognize their own comrades during combat, and every engagement devolved into a free-for-all in which the berserkers fought anything that moved, including each other. The warband survived only because it was large enough to absorb the internal casualties, and because the warriors who survived each battle were, by definition, the most dangerous fighters in the group, ensuring that the warband's overall combat effectiveness remained high even as its composition changed with every engagement. Khorne's own warband, the Butcher Horde, was the largest and most feared of the World Eater's scattered forces. The Betrayer attracted followers the way a gravitational anomaly attracts debris, his reputation drawing berserkers from across the Eye of Terror who wanted to fight alongside the greatest mortal champion of Khorne. The Butcher Horde was not a disciplined force by any standard, but Khorne's ability to direct his warriors' fury toward productive targets, to choose the battles that would yield the greatest harvest of skulls, gave the warband a coherence that most World Eaters' formations lacked. This nomadic, predatory existence became the World Eater's default mode of operation, and it persists into the 41st millennium. The Warbands are perpetual raiders, eternal marauders, a scattered horde of berserkers who descend on imperial worlds and chaos settlements alike, killing everything they find, taking what they need, and disappearing into the warp before the response forces can arrive. The Legion's infrastructure collapsed. The World Eaters had never been the most organized Legion, even before the Nails, but they had maintained the basic systems that allowed a Space Marine force to function: supply chains, communication networks, recruitment and training pipelines, the administrative machinery that kept a fighting force of 100,000 warriors operational. Scalathrax destroyed all of it. Each warband was on its own, responsible for its own supplies, its own recruits, its own maintenance, and the results were predictable. Equipment degraded, ammunition ran low. The warbands that could not sustain themselves through raiding declined, their numbers dwindling as combat losses accumulated faster than new recruits could be found and implanted. The warbands that survived and thrived were the ones that embraced the chaos of their situation, that abandoned any pretense of conventional military organization and adopted the predatory, opportunistic approach that became the World Eater's hallmark in the millennia that followed. These warbands lived by the simple principle that sustained them: find enemies, kill enemies, take what the enemies had: ammunition, equipment, vehicles, slaves, who would be implanted with the Nails and inducted into the warband as new berserkers, skulls which were offered to Khorne, blood which was offered to the same. Khorne earned his title that night, the Betrayer, not because he betrayed the Imperium as all the traitor legions had done, but because he betrayed his own brothers, destroying the last remnants of Legion unity in a single night of madness and fire. The title is worn without comment. Khorne has never explained his actions at Scalathrax, whether they were driven by the Nails, by Khorne's influence, by a final collapse of Khorne's rational mind, or by some dark, calculated decision that the World Eaters needed to be broken in order to become what Khorne truly wanted: a scattered swarm of independent warbands sowing blood and skulls across the galaxy rather than a unified force that could be directed and controlled, is unknown. Khorne cares not from where the blood flows. This is the blood god's most famous axiom, and it is the principle that defines his relationship with the World Eaters more completely than any other statement in the lore. Khorne is not a subtle deity. He does not scheme like Tzeentch. He does not corrupt like Nurgle. He does not seduce like Slaanesh. Khorne demands one thing: violence, blood and skulls, offered in whatever quantity the worshipper can produce, through whatever means the worshipper can employ, against whatever targets the worshipper can find. The blood god does not care about the reasons for the killing. He does not care about the tactics. He does not care about the morality. He cares about the volume. This makes Khorne the most honest of the Chaos Gods, and the most straightforward, and in his terrible way the most comprehensible. You know what Khorne wants. You know what Khorne rewards. You know what Khorne punishes. There is no ambiguity, no hidden agenda, no subtle corruption. There is only blood, and the more of it you spill, the more Khorne favors you. The World Eaters are Khorne's perfect servants because the Nails have stripped away everything that might interfere with the service. A warrior of Tzeentch might hesitate, questioning the tactical wisdom of an attack, weighing the potential outcomes, considering the alternatives. A warrior of Slanesh might pause, savoring the sensation of the kill, lingering over the aesthetics of the violence. A warrior of Nurgle might endure, absorbing the enemy's attacks, waiting patiently for the plague to do its work. A World Eater does none of these things. A World Eater charges. A World Eater kills. A World Eater offers every skull and every drop of blood to the throne, and asks nothing in return except the brief, nails-driven relief that the killing provides. Khorne rewards this purity of service. The Blood God's blessings flow to the World Eaters more readily than to almost any other worshipper, because the World Eater's devotion is absolute, uncomplicated, and untainted by the kind of ulterior motives that the other Chaos Gods worshippers often harbor. A World Eater does not worship Khorne for power. A World Eater does not worship Khorne for immortality. A World Eater worships Khorne because the nails demand violence, and Khorne is the god of violence, and the alignment between the implant's compulsion and the deity's demands is so complete that the worship feels less like a choice and more like a biological imperative. The Blood God's realm in the warp is the Brass Citadel, a fortress of impossible size built from solidified rage and the bones of fallen warriors. The citadel sits at the center of a realm of eternal war, a landscape of perpetual battle where the souls of Khorne's warriors fight and die, and are reborn to fight again, forever, in an endless cycle of violence that the Blood God watches from his throne with the impassive satisfaction of a being whose nature is perfectly aligned with his environment. The World Eaters who die in Khorne's service join this realm. Their souls, freed from the nail's physical cage, enter the spiritual cage of Khorne's domain, where they fight eternally, endlessly, without the pain that the nails imposed, but also without the relief, because in Khorne's realm there is no relief from combat, no pause, no rest, no moment of peace between engagements. There is only battle, forever, and the battle is not a punishment but a reward, because Khorne's warriors were promised an eternity of war, and Khorne has delivered exactly what he promised. Whether this is heaven or hell depends entirely on your perspective. For a World Eater whose nails have consumed everything except the need for violence, an eternity of violence might be the closest thing to paradise that their ravaged consciousness can conceive. For the person who existed before the nails, the warhound who was buried under decades of neural degradation, the eternal battle might be one more cage, one more form of imprisonment, one more existence defined by the violence that they never chose and could never escape. The law does not clarify this distinction. Khorne does not clarify this distinction. The Blood God sits on his throne of skulls and watches, and the skulls pile higher, and the blood flows, and the World Eaters scream, and the screaming is either worship or agony, or both at once, and the distinction to Khorne does not matter. Blood for the Blood God, skulls for the Skull Throne. The World Eaters in the millennia since Scalathrax have existed as exactly what Scalathrax made them, scattered warbands of berserker warriors who follow the strongest champion, who fight anyone and everyone who crosses their path, who offer every skull and every drop of blood to Khorne's throne, and who have long since ceased to be anything recognizable as a military organization. The warbands range in size from a handful of berserkers to hundreds or even thousands, and their composition is as chaotic as their nature. Some warbands retain a thin veneer of organization, with champions who can maintain enough control over their warriors to direct them toward strategic objectives. Others are simply packs of maddened killers who charge in whatever direction the nails drive them, fighting until they are killed or until there is nothing left to fight. The nails continue to eat their brains. Every world eater who carries the implants is on a one-way trajectory toward complete neural degradation, a slow, progressive loss of cognitive function that eventually reduces the warrior to a creature of pure instinct, unable to think, unable to plan, unable to do anything except charge and kill and scream. The end stage of Nail's degradation is a berserker who cannot communicate, cannot recognize friend from foe, cannot stop fighting even when there are no enemies left. These warriors are pointed at the enemy and released like weapons, and their brothers, who know that they are watching their own future, do not mourn, because the Nails do not permit mourning. Angron returned once during the First War for Armageddon. In the early 41st millennium, the daemon Primarch manifested on the hive world of Armageddon at the head of a massive World Eater's force, supplemented by demonic legions. The invasion was catastrophic. Angron and his berserkers tore through the planet's defenses, slaughtering billions, drowning entire hive cities in blood. The Imperium's response was desperate. The Space Wolves, led by Logan Grimnar, were deployed to confront Angron directly, and the Grey Knights, the Emperor's daemon-hunting elite, were sent to banish the daemon Primarch back to the warp. The battle was devastating. The scale of the invasion caught the Imperium unprepared. Armageddon was a hive world, a planet of billions, and the World Eaters descended on it with a force that dwarfed anything the planetary defense forces could oppose. The hive cities, massive structures that housed hundreds of millions of people each, became killing grounds. The World Eaters fought through the corridors and hab blocks and manufactorum levels of the hives with the close quarters ferocity that the Nails demanded. And the civilian casualties were staggering, measured not in thousands but in hundreds of millions. The Imperial Guard regiments that defended Armageddon fought with the courage and determination that the Astra Militarum has demonstrated in every major engagement of the Imperium's 10,000-year history. They held their lines. They fell back to prepared positions. They counterattacked when they could. And they died in enormous numbers, because the World Eater's berserker charges were simply too fast, too aggressive, too completely committed to the close-range combat that the Nails demanded for conventional defensive tactics to contain. The Space Wolves' arrival was the turning point. Logan Grimnar's warriors were among the few forces in the Imperium that could match the World Eater's aggression in close combat. And the wolves fought the berserkers with a fury that was born not from neural implants, but from the genuine visceral rage of warriors who were defending a world full of people against monsters who wanted to drown it in blood. The Grey Knights took horrific casualties, but they succeeded in performing the ritual of banishment that cast Angron back into the Imperium. The cost was staggering. The aftermath was brutal. The entire surviving population of Armageddon was sterilized or mind-wiped to prevent knowledge of the demonic invasion from spreading. The First War for Armageddon was one of the most devastating demonic invasions in Imperial history. Angron manifested at the head of an army that included not only World Eater's berserkers, but legions of cornate daemons, bloodletters and flesh hounds and blood crushers that poured through the warp rift that the daemon Primarch's presence tore in reality. The combination of mortal berserkers and daemonic entities created a force that overwhelmed Armageddon's defenses with a speed that the planet's military governors had not believed possible. The hive cities of Armageddon burned. The World Eaters did not assault the hives the way a conventional military force would, with tactics and objectives and the measured application of force to strategic targets. They simply attacked. They charged the gates, broke through the walls and poured into the interior, killing everyone they found, painting the corridors with blood, leaving the hab blocks and manufactorums choked with the remains of their victims. The Grey Knights who banished Angron paid for their success with the lives of an entire brotherhood. The ritual of banishment required the Grey Knights to maintain their psychic focus while the Daemon Primarch raged around them, killing their brothers one by one. And each death made the ritual harder, because the Grey Knight's psychic power was a collective resource that diminished with each fallen warrior. The brothers who survived the banishment were changed by the experience, marked by the close contact with a demonic entity of Angron's magnitude. And the chapter mourned the dead and honored the survivors, and filed the record of the engagement in the vaults where the Imperium keeps its darkest secrets. The Imperium classified the First War for Armageddon and buried it under layers of secrecy. The people of Armageddon were told nothing, the galaxy was told nothing. The Daemon Primarch's return was treated as an event that had never happened, a hole in the historical record that the Inquisition patched over with silence and threats. But Angron is a daemon. Daemons do not stay banished forever. The warp is patient, and the blood god's hunger is eternal. And the Red Angel waits in the Imperium for the moment when the barriers between real space and the warp thin enough for him to manifest again. But Angron was a daemon, and daemons exist in the warp, where time is meaningless and patience is infinite, and the barriers between dimensions are not permanent obstacles, but temporary inconveniences that erode with every passing century. The blood god waited. Khorne is not a patient deity, not in the way that Tzeentch is patient. But Khorne understands that the greatest harvests of blood come to those who choose their moments wisely. The galaxy would provide the opportunity, the barriers would thin, and the Red Angel would walk in real space again. The opening of the Great Rift provided exactly the opportunity that Khorne had been waiting for. The cicatrix maledictum, the great wound in reality that split the galaxy in half, weakened the barriers between the warp and real space on a scale that the galaxy had not seen since the fall of the Eldar. Daemons that had been banished centuries ago found the barriers thin enough to push through. Warp storms that had been contained for millennia burst their boundaries and flooded into the material universe. And Daemon Primarchs who had been trapped in the warp since the heresy found that the door to real space was, for the first time in 10,000 years, open. That moment came again in the Era Indomitus. After the opening of the Great Rift, Angron manifested on the world of Malak, leading a massive World Eaters invasion force. The fighting drew in significant Imperial forces, and the Daemon Primarch's return confirmed what the Imperium had long feared. Angron could not be permanently destroyed, only temporarily banished, and each banishment was a reprieve, not a solution. The World Eaters of the 41st millennium are, in many ways, the purest expression of Khorne's will in the galaxy. They have been stripped of everything except violence. They have no politics, no ambition, no plans, no goals beyond the next battle. They do not scheme for power like the Thousand Sons. They do not build empires like the Black Legion. They do not pursue forbidden knowledge like the Death Guard pursues Nurgle's gifts. They simply kill. They are killing machines in the most absolute sense. Beings whose neural architecture permits no other function, whose bodies are sustained by the warp's energy and the nail's demands, whose existence is measured not in years or accomplishments but in kills. This simplicity makes them uniquely dangerous. A warband of world eaters that descends on a world does not negotiate, does not communicate, does not respond to diplomacy, to threats, to offers of surrender. The warband lands, charges the nearest concentration of enemy forces and fights until everyone is dead or the warband is destroyed. There are no contingency plans. There are no retreat orders. There is no possibility of parley. The world eaters come to kill, and they do not stop killing until they physically cannot continue. The butcher's nails are still the core of the world eater's identity, 10,000 years after they were first implanted. New recruits, taken from the populations of worlds that the world eaters conquer, are implanted with the nails as part of their induction into the warband. The technology has been maintained, copied, and adapted over the millennia, and while the current versions are even cruder than the copies that the 12th Legion's apothecaries produced during the Great Crusade, they function well enough to produce the desired effect, the transformation of a human consciousness into a nails-driven berserker. The World Eater's gene seed, the genetic material derived from Angron's biology that is implanted in each new recruit, carries the mark of its Primarch's damage. The gene seed itself is not corrupted in the way that some other Legion's gene seed has degraded. The 12th Legion's implantation success rate has remained relatively stable over the millennia, but the gene seed carries a predisposition toward aggression, a neurological tendency that the nails exploit and amplify, and recruits who receive the World Eater's gene seed often display heightened aggression even before the nails are implanted. Recruitment in the World Eater's warbands is not the carefully managed process that loyal Space Marine chapters employ. There are no trials of worth, no decades-long training programs, no filtering of candidates through progressively more demanding tests of physical and mental fitness. World Eaters' warbands recruit through conquest. They attack a world, they kill its defenders, and they select the strongest, most aggressive survivors for induction. The recruits are implanted with the gene seed, surgically modified, and fitted with the butcher's nails. And the process is fast, brutal, and frequently fatal. A significant percentage of recruits do not survive the implantation. Those who do emerge from the process as newly minted berserkers, their previous identities already fading under the nail's neurological assault, their loyalty to their former world and former life erased by the same implants that are consuming their capacity for complex thought. The result is a constant influx of new blood, fresh warriors who replace the combat losses that the World Eater's aggressive tactics inevitably produce. The quality of these recruits varies enormously. Some are former soldiers, trained warriors who adapt to the nail's demands with relative ease. Others are civilians, people with no combat experience who are thrust into a berserker's existence with no preparation, and who either learn to fight or die in their first engagement. The lack of quality control in recruitment is part of what makes the World Eaters so unpredictable. A warband that has recently recruited heavily from a conquered world may contain warriors who are barely functional, whose nails are still fresh, whose bodies are still adapting to the gene seed, who are as likely to kill themselves as to kill the enemy. A warband that has been operating for decades with a stable core of veterans is a different proposition entirely. A force of experienced killers whose nails-driven fury is channeled by years of practice into a devastating, if uncontrollable, combat effectiveness. The warband structure of the World Eaters in the 41st millennium bears no resemblance to the organized company and battalion structure of a loyal Space Marine chapter. Each warband is effectively independent, led by whatever champion is strong enough to keep the others in line, operating according to whatever goals the champion has set, which are usually limited to finding the next fight and killing everyone they find there. Some champions are more ambitious than others. Some have retained enough cognitive function to think strategically, to plan campaigns, to pursue objectives that serve Khorne's interests beyond the immediate gratification of the next kill. These champions attract larger warbands, warriors who are drawn to a leader who can provide consistent access to battle and who can direct the warband toward targets that will yield the greatest harvest of skulls. Others are barely functional. Champions who lead not through intelligence or charisma, but through the simple metric of being the biggest and the strongest and the most violent berserker in the group. These champions attract smaller, more unstable warbands that fight constantly, both with external enemies and with each other, and that fragment and reform with each new engagement. The World Eaters have no homeworld. They have no central command. They have no communication network, no logistics chain, no intelligence apparatus. They are, in the most literal sense, a swarm, a collection of independent predators who roam the galaxy looking for prey, whose only unifying principle is the Nail's demand for violence and the Blood God's demand for skulls. And yet, they are among the most feared forces in the galaxy, because the swarm, for all its chaos, for all its lack of coordination, is composed of individual warriors who are each one of the most dangerous close combat fighters in existence. A single World Eater berserker, armed with a chinax and driven by the Nail's neurological compulsion, is a threat that most conventional soldiers cannot survive. A warband of 100 berserkers, charging across an open field with the speed and fury that the Nails provide, is a force that can break a defensive line that was designed to withstand an armored assault. The World Eaters do not win through strategy. They win through intensity. They hit harder, move faster, and fight with more complete commitment than any other force in the galaxy, because the Nails will not let them do anything else. The Nails do not permit half measures. The Nails do not permit caution. The Nails permit only the charge, the impact, the chinax in the flesh, and the brief, desperate relief that follows. The Red Butchers are the elite of the World Eaters, Terminators who have been so thoroughly consumed by the Nails that they cannot be allowed to walk freely among their brothers between engagements. The Red Butchers are sealed in their Terminator armor, their bodies locked into the massive suits, their consciousness reduced to a single all-consuming desire for close combat. They are transported to the battlefield in armored containers, released when the fighting begins, and recovered, if recovery is possible, when the fighting ends. Between battles, they thrash and scream inside their sealed armor, the Nails driving them to violence even in the absence of enemies, and their brothers give them a wide berth, because the Red Butchers have crossed the line from warrior to weapon, from person to process, and the crossing is irreversible. There is a moment in every World Eater's existence when they realize that the Nails are winning. Not today, not in this battle, But eventually, inevitably, the nails are consuming more of their brain with each passing year, the neural tendrils spreading deeper, the cognitive capacity shrinking, the periods of clarity growing shorter and the periods of rage growing longer. Every World Eater knows that the Red Butchers are not a separate category of warrior. They are the future. They are what every Nails bearer will eventually become, given enough time. This knowledge, the awareness that they are on a countdown toward the loss of everything that makes them individuals, is the World Eater's private horror. It is not discussed openly. It is not acknowledged in the warband's rough social dynamics. But it is there, in the quiet moments between engagements, in the brief windows of clarity that the Nails still permit, in the fleeting instants when a World Eater can remember what they once were and compare it to what they are becoming. Some warriors cope by embracing the transformation, by leaning into the Nails' demands and accelerating the process of degradation, surrendering their remaining cognitive capacity to the implants, in exchange for the greater combat effectiveness that total Nails immersion provides. These warriors become the most fearsome berserkers in the warband, but they also become the most short-lived, their accelerated degradation compressing what might have been decades of remaining functionality into years or months. Others cope by fighting the Nails with every shred of remaining willpower, maintaining their identity through an exhausting, never-ending battle against the implant's neurological assault. These warriors retain their intelligence, their ability to think and plan, their capacity to recognize their brothers and follow orders. But the fight costs them. The constant effort of resisting the Nails drains their energy, leaves them exhausted between engagements, and adds an element of internal conflict to every external battle. Because the warrior is always fighting on two fronts, the enemy in front of them, and the implants inside their skull. Khorne fights on both fronts, has fought on both fronts for 10,000 years. And the effort of that fight, sustained across millennia, is the hidden dimension of his legend. Khorne is celebrated for his combat prowess, for his kill count, for the blood and the skulls and the endless, ceaseless violence that defines his existence. But his greatest battle is the one that no one sees, the battle inside his own head, the war between the warrior who remembers what he was and the implants that are trying to consume what remains. Because a Red Butcher who has not fought in too long is a danger to anyone within reach. Khorne continues to fight. The betrayer is, in the 41st millennium, the greatest mortal champion of Khorne. He carries Gorachild, Angron's own Chinax, and he fights with a skill and a fury that have kept him alive, or at least functional, for 10,000 years. The Nails have not killed him. Whether this is because of Khorne's protection, because of some quirk of Khorne's physiology, or because the betrayer's will is simply too stubborn to submit to the implant's neurological erosion, is unclear. Khorne's relationship with Gorachild, Angron's Chinax, is one of the defining details of his character. The weapon was given to him by Angron, though given is perhaps too strong a word. The Primarch discarded it after his ascension to daemonhood, and Khorne claimed it from the wreckage of the battlefield. Gorachild is one of a pair, its twin Gorefather having been lost during the Heresy. And the weapon's chain teeth are said to be made from the enamel of mica dragons, creatures from a world that the World Eaters conquered during the Great Crusade. Khorne treats Gorechild with a reverence that he extends to nothing else. The weapon is maintained, sharpened, oiled, and cared for with a devotion that seems incongruous in a berserker who destroys everything else he touches. It is the one thing in Khorne's existence that he has chosen to preserve rather than to destroy, and the choice suggests that somewhere inside the betrayer's nails ravaged mind, there remains a capacity for attachment that the implants have not entirely consumed. Khorne's refusal to submit entirely to the nails is his defining characteristic and his greatest achievement. Most World Eaters who have carried the implants for a fraction of the time that Khorne has been alive would have long since degraded into the terminal stage, their consciousness consumed by the nails' relentless neurological erosion. Khorne has been fighting the nails for 10,000 years, and while the fight has cost him, while the nails have consumed most of the person he once was, the core remains, the will remains, the intelligence remains. Some scholars of chaos suggest that Khorne's protection is what keeps Khorne's mind intact, that the blood god values a champion who can think and plan and direct his fury with purpose rather than merely thrashing in the grip of the nails' compulsion. Others suggest that Khorne's will is simply that strong, that the equerry who once served as the voice of reason in a legion of madmen has simply refused to surrender the last fragments of his sanity to the implants that have consumed everything else. The truth may be both. Khorne rewards those who serve him well, and Khorne serves him better than anyone. A mindless berserker kills dozens. A thinking berserker, a champion who can choose his targets, who can direct his fury at the enemies who will yield the most skulls, who can lead other berserkers toward the killing ground that will produce the greatest harvest of blood, kills thousands. Khorne's mind is his most valuable weapon, and Khorne, who cares nothing for subtlety, but who understands the mathematics of slaughter, protects it. What is clear is that Khorne remains something that most World Eaters have long since ceased to be, a thinking being. The nails have not destroyed his intelligence. They have not reduced him to the mindless, screaming berserker that most World Eaters eventually become. Khorne thinks. Khorne plans. Khorne makes tactical decisions, chooses his targets, directs his followers with a clarity of purpose that should be impossible for a warrior whose brain has been eaten by neural implants for 10 millennia. He is not sane. Sanity for a World Eater is a concept that lost its meaning centuries ago. But he is aware. He is present. He is, in a way that his brothers are not, still Khorne. Still the warrior who once served as Angron's equerry, still the captain who reached out to a broken Primarch and convinced him to accept his legion, still the voice that spoke reason to a father who could not hear it. The irony is not lost on anyone who knows his story. The one World Eater who retained his mind is the one they call the betrayer. The one who maintained his identity through 10,000 years of nails and madness is the one who shattered the Legion. The one who is still, in some fundamental sense, himself, is the one who ensured that no one else in the 12th Legion would ever be themselves again. The question of responsibility haunts the World Eater's story like a ghost that the nails cannot drive away. Who is responsible for what the World Eaters became? Who bears the blame for the transformation of a disciplined, honorable legion into a horde of screaming berserkers? The High Riders of Nuceria, who implanted the nails in Angron and created the broken creature that would break his sons? The Emperor, who abandoned Angron's gladiators to die and then deployed their killer as a weapon of conquest? Angron, who imposed the nails on his legion and destroyed the warhound's culture, the sons themselves, who accepted the implants out of loyalty and love and who could have refused, however futile that refusal might have been. The law does not answer this question cleanly. It distributes the responsibility across multiple parties, each one contributing to the tragedy through a combination of cruelty, pragmatism, love, and the kind of desperate, limited decision-making that characterizes people who are operating within systems that they cannot change. The High Riders were cruel because their society rewarded cruelty. The Emperor was pragmatic because the Great Crusade demanded pragmatism. Angron was broken because Nuceria broke him. The sons accepted the nails because refusing would have meant rejecting the father they had waited their entire lives to find. Everyone made the choice that seemed right, or at least unavoidable from their position, and the cumulative effect of all those choices was the destruction of 100,000 minds, and the birth of a legion that would drown the galaxy in blood for 10,000 years. This is how tragedy works. Not through villains and heroes, but through circumstances. Through the accumulated weight of decisions that were each individually defensible but collectively catastrophic. The World Eaters are not the product of evil. They are the product of a universe in which good intentions are not sufficient protection against bad outcomes, and in which the most loving act a son can perform, the act of sharing his father's burden, can be the act that destroys him. The World Eaters are a tragedy, not a villain's story, not a tale of corruption or ambition, or the seductive whisper of forbidden power. A tragedy, in the oldest and most fundamental sense of the word. A story about a good thing destroyed by forces that the people involved could not control. The Warhounds were good, not perfect, not gentle, but good in the way that soldiers can be good, loyal and brave and committed to each other and to the cause they served. The nails took that from them. Angron, who was himself a victim of the nails, inflicted them on his sons because his broken mind could not tolerate the sight of wholeness. And the sons, out of loyalty and love, and the desperate need to share their father's burden, accepted the implants that destroyed them. No one in this story is a villain. Not even the High Riders of Nuceria, who were cruel and exploitative and thoroughly deserving of the extermination they eventually received, but who were also merely human, doing what humans do when they have power over other humans and no one to hold them accountable. Not even the Emperor, who made the terrible choice to save one Primarch and abandon 1,000 gladiators. A choice that may have been strategically correct and was certainly morally catastrophic. Not even Angron, who murdered his legion one brain at a time. Because Angron was a slave, was always a slave, and the nails were his chains, and a chained man cannot be held responsible for the damage he does while trying to break free. The World Eaters are not monsters. They are the wreckage of a collision between a broken father and the sons who loved him too much to refuse his brokenness. They are the evidence of what happens when pain is the only language a person knows, and they teach that language to everyone they touch. They are rage. Pure, undiluted, screaming, bleeding, Chinax-swinging rage. And the rage is all they have left, and the rage is not enough. And the rage will never be enough, because rage is not a purpose. It is not a cause. It is not a reason to live or a reason to die. It is simply noise. Sound and fury signifying nothing, and the nothing is eternal. Because the nails will not let them stop. Somewhere, in the eye of terror, in the great rift, in the spaces between reality where chaos breeds, a World Eater is fighting, He does not know why. He does not know who. He does not know the name of the enemy he is killing, or the name of the world he is killing on, or the name of the war he is fighting in. He knows only the nails, and the pain, and the brief, terrible relief that comes when his chinax bites into flesh and the blood sprays across his visor, and Khorne, sitting on his throne of skulls in the warp, nods in satisfaction. The World Eater screams, not a war cry, not a challenge, a scream of pain, of rage, of the anguish that the nails will not let him express in any other way. The scream echoes through the smoke and the fire and the dying, and it is the sound of the 12th Legion, the sound of the warhounds, the sound of everything that was lost when a broken father hammered iron into the skulls of the sons who loved him. The other Chaos Legions view the World Eaters with a mixture of contempt and caution. The Thousand Sons, whose sorcerers value knowledge and subtlety, regard the World Eaters as crude instruments, useful for absorbing enemy firepower and for creating diversions, but incapable of the nuanced operations that real campaigns require. The Black Legion, Abaddon's empire of traitors, uses the World Eaters as shock troops, pointing them at the hardest targets and letting the nails do the rest. And Abaddon himself regards the 12th Legion's warriors with the pragmatic assessment of a general who knows that his most powerful weapon is also his most unpredictable. The Emperor's children despise the World Eaters. The rivalry between the two legions predates the heresy, rooted in the fundamental incompatibility between Slaaneish's pursuit of sensation and Khorne's pursuit of slaughter. The Emperor's children seek experience. The World Eaters seek destruction. The Emperor's children want to feel everything. The World Eaters want to feel nothing except rage. The two legions fight each other as readily as they fight the Imperium and the battles between them. The clashes between noise marines and berserkers, between sonic weapons and chinaxes, are among the most violent engagements in the Eye of Terror. The Imperium views the World Eaters with the fear that they have earned through 10,000 years of bloodshed. A World Eater's warband descending on an Imperial world triggers an immediate maximum priority response. The planetary defense forces are mobilized. The Astra Militarum regiments in the sector are redirected. Space Marine chapters are contacted if any are within range. The response is not proportionate to the warband's size. It is proportionate to the warband's nature, because the Imperium has learned, through bitter experience, that a small World Eater's warband can cause damage that far exceeds what its numbers would suggest. The fear is justified. A warband of 50 World Eater's berserkers landing on a defended world can kill tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians before they are brought down, if they are brought down at all. The berserkers do not pause to consolidate. They do not establish defensive positions. They charge, they kill, they charge again. And the momentum of their assault is so relentless, so sustained, so completely devoid of the hesitation and caution that normal soldiers display, that the defenders are often overwhelmed not by superior numbers but by superior commitment. The World Eaters commit completely. That is their gift and their curse. The nails do not permit anything less. The scream does not stop. It has not stopped in 10,000 years. It will not stop until the last World Eater falls, until the last set of nails goes silent, until the last echo of Angron's rage fades from the galaxy. And the galaxy is not ready for silence. Not yet, not for a very long time. Blood for the blood god. The words are the World Eater's prayer, their creed, their mantra, the only articulation of purpose that the nails leave room for. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. The words are spoken, screamed, howled, whispered in the brief moments between the pain and the killing. And they are the World Eater's last connection to anything beyond the nail's neurological cage. Khorne sits on his throne of skulls, in the brass citadel, at the center of his realm in the warp. The throne is built from the skulls of every warrior who has ever fallen in combat, every skull that has ever been offered in the blood god's name, and the throne grows with each passing day. Because the killing never stops, because the blood never stops flowing, because the World Eaters never stop screaming. Angron paces the citadel's halls, a daemon Primarch whose consciousness has been reduced to a single infinite loop of rage and memory and rage again. The gladiator who dug his grave on Nuceria is gone. The father who hammered nails into his son's skulls is gone. What remains is the Red Angel, the daemon, the embodiment of everything that the nails were designed to produce, and that Khorne was designed to consume. And somewhere in the galaxy a World Eater is dying. Not quickly, not cleanly. His nails are failing, the neural connectors finally degrading past the point of functionality, the pain signals dissolving into noise, the rage fading into confusion, the berserker's consciousness, such as it is, flickering and dimming like a candle in a wind that has been blowing for 10,000 years. In his last moments, as the nail's grip loosens and the fog of rage lifts for the first and last time in centuries, the dying World Eater remembers something. A face. A name. A moment from before the nails. From the time when he was a warhound. From the era when the 12th Legion was still whole, and its warriors were still capable of the complex emotional responses that the nails destroyed. He remembers brotherhood. He remembers loyalty. He remembers what it felt like to fight beside his brothers with a purpose that went beyond the desperate, nails-driven need for violence. He remembers what it felt like to be human. And then the nails go silent, and the warhound dies, and the galaxy moves on, and the killing continues. In the halls of the brass citadel, the skulls pile higher. On the worlds of the Imperium, the warbands descend. In the warp, the daemon Primarch rages. In the galaxy's darkest corners, the betrayer swings Gorechild and adds another skull to the endless count. The warhounds are dead. They have been dead for 10,000 years. Nothing remains of them except the gene seed that their successors carry, and the faint residual echoes of a culture that the nails consumed before most of the galaxy was born. The World Eaters endure. Not because they choose to. Not because they have a purpose that justifies their existence. Not because the blood god's favor sustains them, though it does. They endure because the nails will not let them stop. Because the pain demands violence, and the violence provides relief, and the relief fades, and the pain returns, and the cycle continues, endlessly, eternally, a loop that has no exit, and no resolution, and no end. Every World Eater carries the warhounds inside them, buried under the nail's neurological static, beneath the layers of degradation and rage and the accumulated damage of centuries of uncontrolled violence. There is a ghost. The ghost of the warrior who accepted the nails out of love for a father who could not love them back. The ghost of the warhound who chose to share his Primarch's burden, because that is what brothers do, even when the burden is a set of iron nails hammered into the skull. The ghost cannot speak. The ghost cannot act. The ghost can only watch, from inside the prison of a mind that the nails have consumed. As the body it once inhabited charges and kills and screams and charges again. Endlessly, purposelessly, driven by implants that have replaced every human impulse with the single, overwhelming demand for blood. The ghost remembers. The ghost remembers what it felt like to be whole, and the remembering is the cruelest thing of all, because the nails can destroy thought. The nails can destroy memory. The nails can destroy every higher cognitive function that the human brain possesses. But the nails cannot destroy the echo, the faint, persistent resonance of a consciousness that once existed and that knows, in the deepest, most indestructible part of itself, that what it has become is not what it was meant to be. The 12th Legion is a wound in the Imperium's history, a wound in the galaxy's flesh, a wound in the soul of every warrior who has ever carried the nail's burden. The wound does not heal. The wound does not scar over. The wound bleeds constantly, and the blood flows downward into the warp, into Khorne's realm, onto the skull throne, where it pools and congeals and becomes the mortar that holds the edifice of skulls together. The Warhounds deserved better. Angron deserved better. The gladiators of Nuceria deserved better. The galaxy that the 12th Legion might have protected, if their father had been whole, deserved better. But this is Warhammer 40,000. And in the grim darkness of the far future, no one gets what they deserve. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. Good night.